Good morning and welcome to everyone who's taken time out to register for this Planning Disrupted webinar this morning. We are super excited that in a time of sitting behind screens and all the ones that you could have joined today, you've chosen to join eThekwini, City of Durban, eThekwini Municipality, ISOCARP, and their partners, and spend some time focusing on planning in times of disruption. My name is Rehana. I'm representing today the South African Cities Network, a network of metropolitan municipalities in South Africa. And we are really excited that eThekwini Municipality has, together with ISOCARP, really tried to create a team to host this webinar. So really our hosts today, eThekwini Municipality, ISOCARP, MILE, which is the Learning Institute of eThekwini Municipality, the ISOCARP Institute, SALGA, SAPI, and the South African Cities Network. We trust that you're going to find today's event both informative and that you will inform the discussions. We have a range of guests who are joining us from across the world. And just a reminder, I think most people are now very familiar with using Zoom, and just a reminder to please keep your microphones on mute unless you're speaking, and preferably keep your cameras off. We do have a very large number of people who've opted to join this webinar, Planning Disrupted, this morning. If you have any technical issues, there's a fantastic team at ISOCARP waiting to assist you. We also will be using a combination of Zoom and a mural board. So you will see the mural on your screen as you're seeing right now. And we hope that you'll be comfortable in this session, that as we move, as I'll take you through the agenda in a little while, that you will feel free to participate, particularly in our breakaway sessions. The session conveners and moderators have been hard at work trying to set up an exciting forum to bring in voices of a range of planning practitioners from across the globe. So just to give you a sense of what the session today is going to feel like and how the flow is going to happen, we'll do a quick overview, an official opening of the session as people are coming on. We're then going to have Milena from ISOCARP giving us insights into a wonderful collaborative project that had been undertaken between the city of eThekwini and ISOCARP, and giving us a sense of the Durban inner city revival. There'll be an opportunity for a couple of quick questions then, and we'll move to breakout rooms and breakaway sessions where your hosts and moderators will enable you to be in conversation about a range of exciting topics, come back from those breakaway sessions, get quick feedback from the 5 breakaway sessions, and that will really be our time together with, of course, some closing words from the city of eThekwini. So we trust that you're all geared up to be participating in the session today. Once again, if you've just come onto this call, wherever you might be joining us from in the world, and as you can see, we've had people register from South Africa, from South African cities, from African cities, but indeed from across the globe. It's really good to have each one of you here today. Never before in our lifetimes anyway, have we all felt so distant and removed from each other while simultaneously feeling so connected in going through a global pandemic simultaneously. And we want to invite you this morning to really, whether you are a local practitioner in your local area, you're in the national planning fraternity, you're coming from international, that you all have views, you all have voices on issues of planning, and that essentially we are in a time of great disruption. But how we choose to respond to this time of disruption is entirely up to us. And the images you're seeing on your screen are quite interesting. The one called Think Differently actually comes from a WhatsApp status of a planning colleague who bought this jumper for her son. And I kind of asked, can we possibly use this for this session? And essentially, I think for all of us, there are opportunities inherent in this disruption. Of course, the past week in particular has been very focused by the notion of I can't breathe. And with COVID-19 being a disease of the lungs, with the focus on Black Lives Matter and what do spaces and inclusive spaces in our cities look like, and how does disruption and this period of uncertainty inform our practice going forward. So before we go into the very heady and heavy discussions of planning and space, I'd like to invite you all, irrespective of where in the world you're joining us from, for us to just consciously come together on this call. And I know it's strange because you don't necessarily know the other people on the call. You might not have met them, but just to come together consciously with 3 definite breaths. So just take a moment to drop into your own body and breathe in and out. Let's work with the inhale and exhale. Breathe in. And across the globe, wherever you're joining us from, and thank you to people who are introducing themselves in the chat. One final conscious collective breath in a time when so many feel like they cannot breathe. Let's breathe in together. So with that breath, you are indeed very welcome, irrespective of where you might be joining us from, and trust that you will find this session both fruitful and meaningful, and that you would be able to shape the outcomes of this session in an exciting way. At this point, I'm going to allow the host of the session, Isokap and Milena, to also echo the words of welcome and give us a sense of this exciting work that has started in relation to issues of the inner city. I have no doubt, no matter where you're joining us from in the globe, that many of you deal with issues of inner city rejuvenation, inclusive inner cities, economic spaces, vibrant spaces for inner cities, and are grappling now with planning disrupted, all the plans you had for your inner cities and what COVID-19 and this pandemic means for them. So, Milena, thank you so much for inviting us at the South African Cities Network to be part of the team that is hosting this webinar, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you so much, Rihanna. As you have mentioned, this have been really a very inspiring collaborative effort between ISOCARP, between South African Cities Network, also with South African Local Governments Association, with South African Planning Institute, MILA Municipal Learning Center of eThekwini Municipality, and of course the eThekwini Municipality itself, which has a history of good relationship with ISOCARP. We collaborate for more than 10 years already. I will start my presentation and share the screen. Just a second. Okay. I hope everyone can see it. I will make it a large image. So as I said, ISOCARP, International Society of City and Urban Planners, has a long-standing relationship with Durban. In 2005, Durban has received our Award of Excellence. In 2018, in 2016, we had our World Planning Congress in the city of Durban, and in 2018, we had our UPAT workshop on Durban Inner City Revival. My name is Milena Ivkovic. I'm a director of UPAT program for ISOCARP, and I will give you a short glimpse into the results, methods, and the process of our UPAT workshop. So, just to say something a little bit about the background of UPAT. UPAT stands for Urban Planning Advisory Teams. We organize different design and planning consultancy workshops all around the world. In 2018, we were invited by the eThekwini municipality to come to Durban and with our team of international experts and meet the local planning experts of the municipality to discuss and come to some kind of conclusions about the possibilities for the inner city revival of city of Durban. You have to imagine what kind of happy and intensive collaborative process for us, for all of us it was. We had 8 different experts with 8 different backgrounds, from design to finance to urban planning, coming from all over the world, from China, from United States, from Lithuania, from the Netherlands, from Canada. And it was really for us 5 very fruitful days to be able to understand Durban in this short period of time, to be able to discuss with our counterparts and colleagues in the eThekwini municipality. It was really priceless. And those 5 days were a high pressure cooker with a lot of ideas and a lot of brainstorming. What we usually do at our workshops, we start with collaborative work on understanding what the situation is, and we start immediately to visit the sites and discuss during these visitations, to discuss with our colleagues what are the main issues. In Durban, we were focusing on the central area and the new plans that are going to be developed for the city, especially for the new marina plan. You see it on the left side. But our task was not only to look into this new future vision for Durban. Our task was also to stay focused on certain points and problems that inner city of Durban has. And in the early stage of our visitation and our talks with the colleagues, we noticed that the city is very much car oriented. So that was one of the first issues we see, the monofunctionality and the segregation within the city due to this domination of the cars and the car industries. Another issue we were asked to take care of and do deeper research is how to actually combine these bold new visions for city of Durban with the need for social housing, with the need for renewal of the inner city. So we immediately started to look into the main, let's say, positive sides of the and potentials of the inner city, taking into account also there are a lot of negative sides happening as well. For instance, safety and security in the public space, a lot of empty properties in the inner city, and some kind of disconnection between the areas and the inner city and the assets it has, the harbor and the beach. So we started with marking out those positive assets, understanding what can we connect within the city, what can be a broad integrated framework for the revival, having in mind the ambition of the city to reinvent itself as a kind of healthy, walkable, prosperous city. So this is what we kind of layered and positioned all the values in the central area right now in the inner city, and combine it with the infrastructure, combine it with the green areas, combine it with the potential areas for development. And the first conclusions that we came to in this exercise was that there are a lot of plans. The plans that were presented by our colleagues from the eThekwini municipality were all excellent and highly quality designed plans. But what was really lacking at this point was a kind of connection, integration, and prioritization of those plans. What comes first? What comes next? How these different plans can really be combined, work together, and make better inner city. There are some, what we say, the hotspots which can serve as, let's say, the next step or the connectors in this whole main framework. So, of course, there's a central business district which needs a lot of upgrade, which has already a lot of upgrade undergoing. And I know there is a lot of things happened between the 2018 and now when we were doing this workshop. We recognize the importance of the river town in this area, but we also looked into the hotspots outside of it, how to make this framework for integral revival of the whole inner city. As I already mentioned, connecting inner city districts and consolidation of many initiatives that are already going was one of the crucial points we started with in focusing into what can be done with the inner city. There are three main issues, or let's say three main points, three main guidelines which we have proposed at the end of the workshop, and that is looking at the new mobility, system to for the inner city, but also for the wider region of eThekwini. How to integrate the plans which are already made, but how to integrate them with the existing values and existing infrastructure on the ground. And finally, how to move to a better adaptation of existing infrastructure. As I said at the beginning of the presentation, car-oriented city is something that really has a negative impact on Durban. In terms of new mobility, we knew at that point the bus rapid transit was to be introduced into the city. We looked at those plans and actually concluded that instead of central terminus in the central business district, it's much better to kind of make a circular bus rapid transit with a lot of stations in the inner city, allowing people to not only come from the outside to the city, but connecting better the inner city itself. There are three important points for the inner city as well. That's the river town, which is this connector to the beachfront. There is there are blocks that are connecting to the marina and the new development, which have a lot of potential, and there is a connection to the Warwick Junction infrastructure section. All of these actions, all of these proposals have to go along with the upgrade of public space and reprofiling, rethinking how can we produce something that we call the road diet, rethinking of many of the main arteries and profiles in the city of Durban, which are at this point too wide. In our final conclusions, we focused on several locations within the inner city, the river town, the drive-in location, and the central precinct. I'm not going to explain them all. Just very briefly, the potential we saw in the central precinct location is, of course, the land ownership, which is a lot of land is actually in the hands of the municipality, which is a great asset and great potential for the restructuring. We gave even some recommendations on how to deal better and more efficient with that. I will not go now into those details, but as you see, we looked at the revival from many aspects and many viewpoints. Very briefly again, what were our results, our recommendations for the revival of the river town, for instance, the neighborhood within the inner city. We really focused on recommending the public space adaptation, but not as a kind of isolated action, but as an action that goes together with all new commercial developments. For the location that was called drive-in, for the new social housing typology, we looked into the existing plans and we came into the conclusion there are just too monofunctional. And the way we should look at the social housing is actually to integrate it with supporting services and education, which is very important for the future population of those areas. As I said, we looked into some of the financial models, into the dynamics of the development of the municipality of Durban at that point, and came out with some very, very simple recommendations on there is so many good things already going on, but they're not visible. So there should be, the face of the revival of the inner city should be made more clear. Think about new investment incentives, and also try to stimulate more public-private partnerships for diversity. I will finish this short introduction to the workshop with the Plan magazine. Plan magazine is a magazine we have bundled all our results and all our details. You can find it on our website. We will share shortly with all of you a link to the issue, so you can really go and read through that magazine with all the recommendations, but also with all the comparisons we made and some details we are proposing for the inner city. And with this, I will. I am actually finishing this part of the presentation, and I will go back now to Rihanna and South African Cities Network to see if we can also already start some Q&A.
Thank you very much, Milena, and a really interesting and exciting journey that ISOCARP and City of eThekwini walked together, and for sharing these results with us. Colleagues, if you joined slightly late, you're still very welcome, and it's great to have you here. We've just had a presentation on the Durban Inner City Revival and the UPAT project that had worked together between ISOCARP and the City of Durban on inner city revival. Of course, in South Africa, our inner cities are very linked to our political history and essentially the flight of capital from inner cities immediately after our democratic dispensation. We'd love to invite in questions for Milena, but also for our colleagues from City of eThekwini, many of whom are on this call. So Subs, whilst Milena has done the presentation, your city was the subject of this work. It would also be good to allow for a couple of minutes. So we'll spend about 10 minutes just checking if there are questions and any clarity you're seeking, any opinions you want to raise. The intention of this webinar is also to get your voices in. So if you'd like to pose a question to Milena or to Subs from City of eThekwini, please just raise your virtual hand and we'll note that question. If not, I'll use the facilitator's prerogative and pose a couple of questions of my own. So let's just see if there are, if you'd like to engage with the presentation that has just been made, if you have questions, irrespective of, you've never been to Durban, you don't know, but you want to understand better how this project worked and how some of these findings were arrived at, please feel free. So I note Rashid Osinowo. I'll just take a round of 3 to start in case there are more hands. Okay, let's start with Rashid. So Rashid, if I can ask that you unmute yourself, introduce yourself, tell us where you're from, and then feel free to put your question to Milena.
All right, thank you. I really appreciate what you are doing. I do a very, very good job. My name is Rashid Oshinawa. I'm calling from Lagos, Nigeria. I'm an urban planner. I have a consultancy firm that is basically based in Lagos, and we deal with issues with, around urban planning and just what you're doing there. But my contribution to the discourse basically is to let us know the fact that we have similar issues here, also in Lagos. You know, everywhere that is called urban, there is always this tendency of urban sprawl, and the need to do renewal, the need to just similar. But my question is this: how do you deal with people that you know, that are occupying a particular space illegally, and maybe what we can call a slum or favela or thereabouts? How do you deal with such how do you deal with such in your report or in your study? So I would like to share. I'd like you to share that with us, so that I'll be able to know, at least to have an insight how you deal with such, because we have what we do here.
Okay, Rashid, I think we got the question, so I'm just going to take a couple of other hands and allow Milena to respond. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Thank you.
I think it's Sneha Singh. Please feel free to give us your question. I hope I've got the pronunciation right, Sneha. If you'd also just introduce yourself.
Yes, hi everybody. Really happy to be a part of this webinar. I'm logging in from India, Bangalore, and I'm an urban planner with an architecture background. Melina, I think that was a fabulous presentation. And as an urban planning student, I recently graduated. It's been a year. I got to work on the development plan of Rajkot city, which is in Gujarat. And I realized that when you're making a development plan, or when you are trying surgical methods to sort of, develop or sort of rejuvenate a city which is there, or work on the city core, we might want to look forward to public-private participation, as you very correctly said. Now, it is a challenge to sort of bring on board private people to come and invest in development of a city in a country, because the investment is huge, and the risk for returns are huge. And it also takes a very long time to get those returns back. So how do you think we can incentivize private people to be a part of our planning process? That's my question to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I'm going to close the round of questions, because there have been two from Rashid and Sneha. There's also been a comment from Michael in the chat, Milena, around the issue of release of public land as contested space. So I think three really important issues around inclusivity, managing people who've occupied land in inner cities, issues around how do you stimulate and work with private sector, and then the whole issue around release of public land and some of the challenges inherent in the release of public land. So Milena, over to you.
Thank you, Ihana. It's it's always a challenge when you're the first one presenting. You get all these difficult questions. I really appreciated all the questions. I also appreciate the fact that we have so many people who are coming from the similar contexts, like South Africa and like Durban. On the first question about the illegal occupation and urban development and how can we deal with it? How did we deal with it when we were in Durban on these for this workshop? First of all, as I said in the beginning, we came with an international group of experts with all different backgrounds on all different urban planning contexts and different development levels of their city and development levels of the agencies of the planning for the city. what we have experienced during the 5 days, and that's really big thanks to the eThekwini municipality for organizing it in a quality way, is that we were able to dedicate one whole day of our workshop just to talk with the different representatives, different active groups within the city of Durban, who are dealing with these issues of informality, illegality, etc. So there is a dialogue between, let's say, certain NGOs, non-profits representing these groups and the municipality. The solutions are also there. There is a lot of thought through coming from the Durban municipality. It is usually the implementation when things get really difficult. But we were all very much surprised, pleasantly surprised with the openness and the dialogue of representatives of those groups to be part of the planning process. So that's the first step. If I have to give some kind of very quick recommendation now, or to reflect on the results of our process in Durban, is try to organize the planning process as inclusive as possible. Try to organize things on the ground to be able to reach out to those vulnerable groups, or to reach out to those informality groups, and make this kind of bridge between the informality and the formal planning processes within the city. Why is this important? Because those voices need to be heard, and it's also important, even when the commercial developments are ongoing, to be part of that process, and in a way demand solutions. When we were thinking about the social housing, and this is where I'm going to go to the second question about the public-private partnerships and how to actually make an atmosphere, make a context good enough to where social housing can strive in a way that it's not only just a simple shelter, but that it really offers something more, is when we were discussing the drive-in location, and when we were discussing the plans for the drive-in location, which was totally dedicated for social housing, and also meant to be a kind of solution for the informality as well. We had to understand the social housing subsidy systems in South Africa, which is quite complicated. And we tried to give us a quick answer, a quick brainstorm on that, and direct the development of social housing into the mixed development. Because just providing a shelter is not enough if you do not provide some basic level of service, meaning markets in the vicinity, meaning education in the vicinity, meaning the possibility of workplaces in the vicinity. Only with this combination of different factors, social housing can really strive. And in that mix that can be one of the solutions how to attract more private investors, so they can be part of this, let's say, mix, if they're not responsible for building the social housing itself, which is a non-commercial project. I hope I gave you some kind of inspiring answer to that. Of course, there are other approaches, there are other methods, but this is just a very quick one based on our experience in Durban. And
sorry, can we just remind people to keep their mics on mute unless they're the ones speaking? Otherwise, we're going to get disturbances. Milena, can I give you 2 more minutes?
Yes, I will. I'm going now to the last one, to the wrap up, the last question about the public land and how do we deal with this. Yeah, it is a highly contested space. But as I said, when we were in Durban with all our experts with different backgrounds, we really had to wrap up our minds how to give a best answer to the eThekwini municipality, coming from very different systems of dealing with public land and urban land. And one of the biggest advices or guidelines we could give to the eThekwini municipalities actually to think again in introducing the real estate company of the municipality itself, which can then regulate, operate, take care and develop the city in a let's say more just way. I hope that's the last answer I had to give. Thank you.
Thanks, Milena. Thanks, Milena. So Subs, I know this wasn't part of our plan, but we are in a planning disrupted webinar. So I'm going to disrupt a little bit.
Yes.
Subs, you had 8 experts from 8 different contexts, 5 very fruitful days, as Milena has indicated. But ultimately, when they pack up their bags and they write up their recommendations, it's left to the city of eThekwini to really think through some of these contestations, some of the complexities. So it'd be really interesting to get your view as a city practitioner in relation to this exercise and what it means for you.
Okay, good morning everyone, and thanks Rihanna and Milena. Yeah, I'm on the spot on this one, but let me try. So firstly, I think thanks to the UPAT team that came through. It was really a nice way to introduce how you can get a multidisciplinary team that descends and embeds itself for 5 days in a municipality. But the team had also done a lot of work before, and we continue to work right now. It is a difficult project for anyone who's worked in an inner city, especially in a South African context, and I would presume in an African context, and I guess also Asian context. It's, you know, there's a lot more fluidity, there's a lot more local politics, there's a lot more that's happening than in some other kind of context. What we have done is we've actually, since the time that the ISOCOP team was there, we've actually concluded and in the process of also completing a number of projects. So on the project side, we're pretty good. Like we extended our promenade, and those that are local people that know about it has just been excellent. It's like probably the best public space in Africa that you can come and visit. We've also, Rivertown is in the throes of implementation. So if you go there, you know, even though we've been in lockdown for a while, you can go there and you can see actual work being happening. We've also increasing our water availability in the area for more and higher densities to serve the point area and the rest of the inner city. So if you drive into the inner city, you'll see some construction work taking place. We've also have a number of small and international businesses that have come into the city to regenerate. And I think that goes in with the notion of public-private partnerships. I think from the business side, it really depends what the business is looking for as a rate of return, what it looks at in terms of stability in the area, a municipality, services are important, urban management is important, how it can access the political side as well as the administration side. So it's not just about how pretty a place looks or how inviting, but what are the underlying factors that makes it valuable for business to enter. And then of course it's the market. So we've seen a lot of one of our foreign investors that has come through. The market there has really been around small, medium enterprise office space, a lot more pop-up stores, restaurants, dealing with like enclaves, you know, like the lawyer, the legal fraternity. So we have a professional quarter that is developed in the middle of the CBD. We have a leisure, recreation, new eateries, etc. that have come through. And then we also have student housing, a range from a lower income level to a high level in terms of like professional quarters or postgraduate quarters. So that has been a lot of the mix that has happened in the inner city. I also know because of time delays, what we also have is instruments. We have an urban development zone, which is a national tax incentive, but it really works if you're doing something big enough. If you're under that radar, then obviously you don't gain. We also have an economic incentive that supports inner city housing at a particular density. So, you know, if you're 5-story walk-ups, etc., and you have your densities, it is supportive of that. And now we also looking at a regeneration incentive, because a regeneration project is very different to greenfields. So, you know, you buy into a place, you don't have your rentals, you have half of the place full, etc. How do we provide some kind of incentives? And now that we're in lockdown, we've actually waived all our planning application fees. So, you know, you can come in there, you can do a special consent, you can do a rezoning, you can do a building application, and you don't have to pay. So at least it's taken away some of the risk. Regarding the issues about illegal businesses and occupation, that is a struggle, but part of it is to also read what is the market saying and how you can regularize and bring it in, and rather try and constantly fight something and go against the grain. So part of that is what we try and do around the informal economy, but there's also good business and there's bad business. So often we only think about the informal economy, but we have a number of formal sorts of businesses that will just do as it pleases. You know, it will go and do construction work. It will, what we call workhouses, like really problematic type of accommodation or working spaces. People will just do this overnight. So we constantly have to use our legal compliance, our national building regulations, our planning compliance, and we need to respond. And the last thing we do in terms of a real estate component is, if you don't agree with all of these processes, we then knock you on a rate basis. So every type of rate has a particular value to the, you know, like a percentage of value to like, it's like 3 cents on residential, and it might be 15 cents on industrial. So if you're illegal, we really take you 9 times the value. So then you really start paying a whole lot. And that could also lead to expropriation, etc. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thanks, Subs. It was really great to get the combination of kind of Milena and the ISOCOP perspective, and then the City of eThekwini perspective. Colleagues, at this stage, as we indicated in the agenda, as part of your registration process, you were given an indication that there would be 5 breakaway sessions. So we're going to be, in the next couple of minutes, moving into the breakaway sessions. Can I just ask that everyone keep their mics on mute, please? So we're going to be moving into the breakaway sessions now. And there are 5 of them, which you've pre-registered for. So each of the breakaway sessions will run for at the same time for half an hour. Each breakaway session does have a moderator and a team that will be taking care of you there, both on the technical side and the content side. And then we'll be coming back. So I know that some of you were very intrigued and wanted to be in more than one of these sessions, but you will at least get a flavor of the ones you were not in, because we'll come back and the moderators will give us a sense of some of the discussions that happened, at least a high-level summary.
Good morning, colleagues and fellow planners from South Africa and around the world. It is indeed an honor and privilege to present this topic to you, Planning Practice in Flux. My name is Prashina Mohongi, and I work at the South African Local Government Association based in KwaZulu-Natal. I am joined by 2 of my colleagues, Siwe Ntombela and Kayla Brown, from the South African Cities Network. The COVID-19 pandemic has affected our lives in unprecedented ways, and everything we thought we knew, we no longer know. We have no certainty that anything will go back to what it was. We don't know what will remain, what will be changed, and we don't even know if we'll still be here. Planning practice and the planning profession is not immune to this wave of unlearning and relearning narrative. And we want to today focus on deconstructing planning practice and looking at what impacts this global pandemic has had on planning and planning practice, but more especially focus on what needs to be done and what kind of mindset is required to stand up to this global pandemic today and beyond. The one thing that the pandemic has brought to light is the vast discrepancies in the built form and the extreme polarities that coexist in our built form. We have seen the neat, quiet streets of suburbs during the level 5 lockdown versus the dense, overcrowded settlements where practicing social distancing was an unimaginable concept, purely because of the layout of the settlement. We have seen people queuing outside supermarkets versus people desperately in need of food parcels. we have seen a vast amount of communities stranded without basic services and the plight of the homeless. And of late, we've noticed an increasing amount of people lose their jobs because of the economic meltdown as a result of this global pandemic and move back to their family homes, which are out of the city, giving rise to a new wave of migration. Some of these polarities are a reflection of the decisions that we have taken as built environment practitioners in the past 20 years as we've constructed a post-apartheid built form. The media has covered extensively the plight of ordinary citizens, showcasing the hardship and distress faced during this pandemic and the dissatisfaction with the provisions of government and, of course, planning practice. So where to from here? Do we continue to do work and lead in a fashion that creates these extreme polarities, or do we chart a new course? And what will this new course be like? What will we need? We want to sponsor two ideologies to turn the ship around. The first is the idea of woke leadership. Leadership that is conscious of the leadership's decisions taken, leadership that takes into account all the facets of human existence and aims to bring about change that is deliberate for the well-being of all that occupy space and place. The polarities that we have seen is indicative of a leadership style that is not in tune with deliberate and progressive change. We are of the firm belief that planners have imbued in their character a leadership DNA, and communities are asking for that leadership DNA to be activated and to be used positively to change the lives of people, using the leadership skills that are part of who we are. The second belief that we want to sponsor to this dialogue to turn the ship around, and which we believe will enhance that of woke leadership, is that of planning activism. You would have received reading notes around this in the packs that were emailed to you. And here we are looking at planners must be activists for change. We cannot accept the status quo and continue feeding a planning style that perpetuates fragmentation and polarities in the way we have seen. Through the work undertaken at SALGA and at the South African Cities Network, in particular the Chronicles of a Change Agent, and the work undertaken by the Built Environment Integration Task Team at the South African Cities Network, both of which look at the work and daily lives of planners and politicians in the built environment, we can confirm that planning activism is definitely a concept that we must adopt. However, some of us might feel that by adopting this activist mindset in the built environment, we might be going against the tide. And yes, going against the tide is exactly what is demanded of us. Being able to stand up and pursue a new narrative that questions decisions and opens up debate and dialogue is what is being demanded by the communities we serve. We are being asked to connect to our agency and consciousness, and question now remains, how do we do that? How do we give rise to a new world order that is progressive and undeterred in the pursuit for the improved quality of life? Colleagues, the question that we want to pose to all of you today is, what is it that we could do where we are to affect change in a positive way and to decrease these polarities as we see now? I want to hand you over to Siwe Ntombela, my colleague at South African Cities Network, who will further take you through the session. Thank you.
Thanks, Prashina, and welcome everyone. Thanks so much for joining us in this session. I just want to encourage that we have some debate and conversation, and I'm looking forward to the inputs that we can have around this topic about what has had to shift around our planning practice and maybe what we'd like to take forward post the COVID-19 pandemic into the practices that we engage in every day in our practice, but also understanding around all the different you know, circumstances that we engage with in terms of the people that we're serving in our planning practice. So before we get into the conversation, I just want to remind everyone about muting when you're not speaking. And I see everyone is muted. But I'd like us to maybe have some conversation, some of the questions that I'm going to pose, so we can use the chat function to input whatever questions or ideas that you have. But you can also raise your hand, as Anna has nicely asked for you in the chat. So maybe the first question relating to what Prashina was speaking about in terms of, you know, what polarities and different circumstances have been revealed through the pandemic about all the inequalities that we face in our communities that we serve, but also the intersecting realities of people and how that's been manifested in the COVID-19 pandemic. I just want to understand maybe from the colleagues in the room about what sort of changes have had to occur within the organization or the space that you work in with regards to your practice and what it's meant for you in your everyday life. I mean, if I can just pose an example, there was a colleague that we engaged with from our Built Environment Integration Task Team at the South African Cities Network, who, you know, sort of gave us an indication of what has had to change with regards to creating policy, for example. So, you know, they've had to now engage in processes where before they could take up to, you know, 3 months to up to 12 months to develop a piece of policy. But that time has, you know, been reduced to 3 hours. I mean, colleagues have had to develop policy and legislation within 3 hours and implementation plans, speaking to how responsive practitioners have had to become in this time. So I'd like to invite colleagues to understand, maybe within your organization or in the context that you work in, what are some of the shifts and practices that you've had to engage in order to become more responsive in your practice and organizations. So yeah, please, I'd like to encourage us to have some debates, maybe in the chat as well, if I could have some inputs. And maybe this is also about understanding, you know, where practitioners are having to, you know, bring more of themselves and understanding a more empathetic view as in the way that they are engaging with the work. So I just be interested to understand what has had to change in the way that you have been working, or in the way that you've had to engage with the communities that you work with, or in your institution with regards to your own planning practice, and how that has shifted you towards change. I'm not seeing any hands. I'm not sure what is happening, whether colleagues are shy.
So Siwe, you might have to volunteer.
I have to. Maybe I'm seeing Steve from, I think from eThekwini. Steve, I'm not sure if you'd be able to maybe bring in your view, specifically because we're speaking about ISOCARP and eThekwini. I'd be interested to hear what other views or situations that you've had to, you know, encounter with regards to this question of what has had to change. Steve, are you there?
Yes, I am here, Siwe. I think it's a great question. I'm not sure if I'm best placed to answer it, but I think we find ourselves, I'm currently placed in the catalytic projects unit of eThekwini, largely looking at facilitating private sector development. So obviously there's been a huge impact in terms of what COVID's done and the impact on the economy and the resultant impact on the private sector appetite for take-up. And then obviously the resultant income cuts in the city and that on projects. So I think for now it's really it's a matter of just being flexible, trying to understand how we need to respond, how we're going to do things differently because the landscape has changed. It's not going to be business as normal. So what can we do as a city to continue to support the private sector, acknowledging that they, in a lot of cases, in a very different space right now, and acknowledging that things have also changed. A lot more people are working from home. There's going to be an impact in terms of requirements for office space and office take-up, and how does that impact on developers' plans in terms of their anticipated markup. So I think for us, it's, yeah, we've seen the change, we've seen the impact, we've seen investors pull out because of the economy, and it's now how, for us to really think about how do we respond to that? How do we need to stay flexible and responsive? I'm not sure if that helps, but that's my initial thoughts.
Thanks, Steve.
Sue,
Sure.
I'm sorry. Okay.
Go ahead.
No, certainly I don't see where to raise hand in my, I think technology is still a challenge with me. I want to greet everyone, Kulegani Zulu from Impende Municipality, KZN, in South Africa. My input in your question or in this discussion, during the lockdown in this pandemic, one thing that I noticed was when everything is shut down, is locked down, the three important things which kept going. That was food, medicine, and ICT. So noticing those things, I think as planners, again, we need to, again, when we do our policy thinking and rethinking on the issue of how is it driving us to now, to say, how are we going to utilize ICT as well as planners in order to deal with issues? Like, for instance, we are at the era where we are, as municipalities in South Africa, we are approaching our financial year end. We had performance targets for the year in which we could not achieve, and we had to pass budgets and do all the stuff. So now, in order for our mayors now to do their budget, but public participation, we had to rethink and use your WhatsApp, your Facebook things. So we also need to look at those things and again to say, are we still going to do the things the way we normally do? If food was so important, if medicine was so important, whilst everything, transport was locked down, everything was locked down, movements, people. So we need to see how important food is. That takes me to the Agricultural Land Act, subdivision of agricultural land in South Africa, to say this act, as much as it might seem as somehow delaying developments, as investors would like to develop land and agriculture coming with this act, and it irritates them. But now COVID-19 has proved how important it is to think about reserving land for agriculture and preserving land which is suitable for agriculture and environmental, especially wetlands, where we get our rain, so that we enhance our food system. So it just came to my mind that we have to think along those lines, on those three lines. Thank you.
Thanks for that input. I think it's really important what you're raising there about community participation in a time of where, you know, gatherings are prohibited, but also brings to mind the issue of inequality and our lack of, you know, equal access to these different technologies, which is something that we all also need to think about in the future of inclusive development. But I'd just like to take some hands. I see Nuthin, I think you had a hand up.
Yes, thank you, Siva. I'm Nuthin Maharashtra. I'm from the Economic Development Unit. The question around what this experience of the pandemic has brought to us and what needs to change. So the Economic Development Unit has been engaged in a program entitled Subnational Doing Business. It's a program that's sponsored by the World Bank and National Treasury, and the key outcome of that program is to create the ease of doing business in the city, to make the city more competitive. And it's really, together with all other metros in South Africa, have engaged for the last 4 years in this program, seeking to redefine our business processes so that we create we create a better, an easier environment for business to locate in the city and to operate. So the programs looked at the outcome of reducing time, costs, and procedures for business locating within the city. So the point I want to make here, and the urgency that this brings out, to answer your question around what are the urgencies. So in the last 4 years, the city has been looking at various projects across the clusters that contribute to the ease of doing business. And we've been engaged in a number of reforms to make our business processes easier and more accessible, and to make the experience of investors pleasant within the city. So the point I want to make is that whilst we've been doing all of this and we've had time frames attached to each of them, what we found that this pandemic required us to expedite reforms that we've been trying to implement for the last 4 years. We needed to expedite access to resources and business systems, IT systems, etc. We needed to relook at integration. And what the city has achieved in the last 6 to 8 weeks is that we're now able to allow our investors to apply for their construction permits, for example, and submit planning approvals online. It's an intermediate online system, but it was a key outcome of the World Bank across all the cities that they do assess with regards to the ease of doing business. But we've achieved this as a city in the last 6 to 8 weeks. Yes, the system is tested and it's up and running. It will improve as it evolves. But the point I want to make is that this is just proof that if there's an urgency, resources can be pulled together and can achieve outcome in short time. As government, we need to reconsider how we do business, to remove red tape, to remove terms of planning, and to really invest where it matters. And that's my take on the urgency that the pandemic has posed and how the city has reacted. Thank you.
Thanks, Nuthan. I noted Enoch had a hand while you were speaking, but I'd just like to, invite colleagues to engage with some of the conversations that are coming up in the chat, specifically around what Prashina had spoken about planning activism, and what this has meant for, the type of actions that practitioners themselves can take in terms of in your space, in your capacity, in your department, or whatever it may be. What are some of the opportunities that you'd like to take advantage of right now, but also what are some of the opportunities that you've seen now in terms of what you'd like to carry forward in practice? I mean, Newton, you were speaking about how you've had to, expedite certain practices. So what are some of those activities or, places where you'd like to push in terms of the future of planning practice, about what can we do differently now as practitioners that can influence and creating a better system that can speak truth to power, like Sugan has spoken here, has pointed out here. So I'm interested really to point to this question here on the screen about what in our own practice can we do to change and shift towards what we'd like to see. Enoch, I'm not sure if you'd still like to give your input. Okay, I don't think Enoch is still there. So colleagues, yes, I'd really like to engage further on this about what we can do as practitioners on our own practice in our own space. There was someone who commented here earlier saying that, you know, she's not really a planner, but really interested in this issue of development. So it's also about understanding the future of planning practice, of the types of practitioners that we want to bring into our institutions, into the space. What are we doing now? What can we do now? What opportunities are there now that we can take advantage of in order to shift practice in maybe small ways? Maybe it's about small, massive changes. So what are some of the practices that you'd like to take forward in terms of the ideas that you know, people were suggesting about using social media and in order to continue community engagement in the practices that we need to fulfill? Rihanna, do you have some more input? I'm not really able to catch up on the chat here.
So I mean, Siwe, I've got so much voice in the main room. I'd love to hear other voices, but I really want Sogan to bring in some of what he's been posting in the chat to just hear his voice, because I think these are important conversations. And even Imani, who said, I'm a high school student, and she's, you know, taken the time out to join this call.
Yes.
So let's open the room for alternative voices. But I mean, I think that the issue of political admin interface and this notion of that's one of the reasons why planners feel they can't be as bold as they'd like to be. I think let's confront that one head on.
Sugan, would you like to go ahead? We'd like.
Hi, Siwe. Yes, sure. Thanks. Hello, everyone. It's a difficult one to talk about because it's sensitive, but I like the idea to actually have an opportunity, and I think Rihanna's instigating. That's good. We have to address the elephant in the room. So firstly, let me quickly say, COVID-19 has given us an absolutely amazing opportunity for planning to reclaim that space. In the past, we've been apologetic, we've been far too humble, and I think here's an opportunity for planners to lead. I think that's the first very important point. I think from research that I've done with 87 planners, it was found that very much so the number one issue that's constraining planners now, that's not allowing them to become activists, is they feel that they are under pressure from political leadership. And this is an issue that has to be addressed. So it is there. I think since publishing the paper and making it available and putting it out into the public domain, and I think a lot has changed. I think people are wanting to talk about this more and more. But I think through SALGA, to the cities network, we need to have some dedicated opportunities to talk a little bit more about that. I want to change the narrative a little bit to make it more positive, right? So how do we actually turn this around? And everyone knows, and I'm sorry if this is very South African, right, for those who are not from South Africa, but every municipality in the country must prepare integrated development plans. For me, I think there's the space, there's the opportunity. Let's not produce these 500-page big documents and just do it for compliance sake. Why don't we use this integrated development plan to truly transform? I think planners have this opportunity. We should be looking at how to engage the poorest of the poor, look at issues of the informal economy. Subs earlier in the main session was talking about some radical stuff where you don't have to pay for the next year to submit plans, how to allow people to work from home, etc., etc., etc. So I think there are challenges, but let's be positive and let's see what spaces there are to make a difference. Thank you.
Siwe and Kyla, it might be useful for you to just talk a little bit about kind of the last BAIT meeting, having Lerato from Slovo Park Informal Settlement join the call. Just some of the practical things that we've been doing at Cities Network in BAIT to push back against what the system assumes is accepted and normal, including some of the IDP guidelines work that we did.
So Rihanna, Unfortunately, we have, only 4 minutes left, but yeah, maybe just to speak to that point is to say, how do you bring in, community voice within such a platform where practitioners are speaking amongst themselves, but to also confront more in an empathetic way to understand the difficulties that practitioners themselves are also facing within that space, but also democratizing the space, because it's always, just once off sort of engagement between communities and practitioners, but how do we create generative conversation amongst practitioners and the communities that they're serving in a sustainable way that's beyond just, the tick box exercise that is in many cases the types of community engagements that practitioners have to engage in. I'm just looking, apparently we've had just a bit of an extension, so we can continue with this conversation, colleagues.
Siwe, yes. Can you bring Mandisa in? Because I think she's raising some really important stuff in the chat, but sometimes in the chat you lose the nuance of what people are saying. Can you bring that voice into the room?
Sure. Mandis, I'm not sure, I'm not really able to, see everything that's happening in the chat, but please do just give your input with regards to what you're saying about the challenges that are manifesting in the space. Mandisa, are you there?
Hello.
Oh, hi.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you just bring some, can we just discuss what you were talking about in the chat? Yeah.
Yes. Sorry, I just felt that I should just jot them down whilst the discussion was happening. For me, it's basically as indicated in my chart. I'm saying we were never ready for this challenge, and what we have seen is that whilst we now have to work from home, and before working from home was not a norm, it was a by the way issue and maybe a gap stopper where you are not in the office. Now we are required to be working, or during the lockdown, we were required to work from home, and we were not ready in terms of having tools of trade. There were people that didn't even have laptops. So a person like that is supposed to be at office and accessing maybe a desktop. We were not available on various platforms. For instance, I only knew about Zoom during lockdown. I only knew about MS Teams during lockdown, whilst other platforms may have been there before, but we were not necessarily using them. And some people were not necessarily available. There are people that are still not available on other platforms, and when you want to engage, you can't get them on this platform, you have to use the other. And a huge issue is access to data. If you have to engage in this platform, you need access to data. And in South Africa, people are also now trying to get used to Google Classroom. Now you have to have access to data for your work purposes. You have to have access to data for children to be able to attend school. And some of us, whilst they were available, were not necessarily able to do everything, and other people were just in a state of shock and anxiety and not available at all. And so work had to stop. While some people were innovative and making use of what they have and trying to move forward. So there was this state of not being sure what's happening, people not available, people available. And now with the lockdown and the things that have been taken into the fore, we need to look at what is it that we have to do as planners. Are we still focusing on the basic needs, or the basic needs have changed now? Is it basic needs as we know them? And Kulekani from Mpendle indicated that during lockdown, there were 3 issues that kept going: food, IT, and medicine. Now, if we are to plan, what are the critical things that we need to look into moving forward? I've just added that maybe we also need to look at access to water. During lockdown, during coronavirus times, you have to wash your hands frequently, and there are communities that do not have access to water for basic needs. Now, if you have to wash water frequently, what do you wash that water with? Between water and sanitizer, water is the basic, because sanitizer is something that other people will never see in their lifetime. So we need then to look at how do we plan in a manner that is saying we're planning for a decent living, and we're also noting the things that have been brought up by COVID-19 and what those things are. Your access to data might be one, and we need to ensure that we try as planners to ensure that people must have access to data. What are the ways to do that? How do we plan for water? And how do we ensure that we reserve land for agriculture and we promote agriculture? So there's a lot of things that we need to do. And in fact, the other discussion is on community engagement. What are the best ways to engage communities? Yeah. And is there a need? Sorry, just last one. Is there a need that maybe we review the policy environment in which community participation is to happen? Because currently you have to change the way you do things, and then there's also legislation that you may be challenged that you have not done ABC in terms of what the legislation is requiring. Let me pause there. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mandisa. Just on your last point, actually, that's what I wanted to pick up on, was a point from Langaletu about exactly that point about planning processes and community engagement methods. You know, there was a point about, I'm not sure if you'd be able to just give some inputs. I'd like to invite you to expand on that point, Langaletu, about what you said about questioning the relevance or effectiveness of that sort of engagement.
No problem. Thank you very much, Zoe. Colleagues, I was just thinking out loud during this pandemic as I've been working from home. I am a town planner that works primarily with processing of applications, statutory applications, as well as special plans. And during this lockdown, obviously, there has been a lot of these applications within my municipality, within my desk, which I am working on. Now, with many of the newspaper publications being closed and developers be unable to basically access this service to proceed with their business, to proceed with placing their adverts as required by legislation, does it mean that now these processes should stop? Can't we use other methods to actually engage with the people? Because I was also thinking about how effective social media has been in engaging with people, particularly during presidential campaigns.
Welcome, colleagues. My name is Ashraf Adam, and I've been asked by eThekwini and the South African Planning Institute to facilitate this session. It's the first time that I'm doing this, facilitating a breakaway session online. It's going to be interesting. The assistant is Federico. You can see him. He's gonna, any technical issues we have, and if there are any questions, you can just maybe send them to him and he'll send them through to me, or we'll find a way to deal with it. The session topic is the dark side of planning. And we had someone scheduled to give us 4 slides this morning, but he's unfortunately, Professor Khan has unfortunately not been able to come because he's suffering from some kind of COVID symptoms, he says. I'll take him by his word. But I thought what we could do is perhaps have a bit more of an open conversation, and I would maybe just make a few points which I think are some of the dark sides of planning that we could maybe talk about, and perhaps have a more of an open conversation rather than something strict and narrow in our focus and things like that. So the 4 broad areas around the dark side of planning that I've been thinking about actually arise out of some of the points that were presented this morning. And for me, that is the complexities of planning. If you look at the complexities around planning all over the world, whether it is in South Africa or in China or wherever it is, there are several complexities that have to be dealt with at the same time. Whether they be heritage, whether they be economic, whether it be social, whether it be environmental, it can be a whole range of stuff. And the moment you have that, you have a whole range of interest groups that you have to begin to engage with. And once you do that, you go down a rabbit hole of engagements. And I think that takes you to the dark side, where you get all kinds of people, all kinds of views, and all kinds of interest groups that you have to navigate. And I thought that would be one dark side of planning that we might want to think about. The complexities of planning creating its own dark sides. Linked to that, which for me is a really big dark side of planning, and that's the issue of contestation and elite formation and elite capture. So if you look at the power of planning, it lies within the allocation of resources. Planning is about the allocation of resources, whether that is immediate or over time. And it is people in power or who contest for power who determine where those resources get allocated. And in that context, particularly in poorer countries, it is not only the rich who are the elites, it's in fact the poor who also constitute elites, particularly in countries like South Africa, which have a welfare kind of system where the state says, don't worry, we'll provide you with houses, we'll provide you with free health, we'll provide you with this, that, and the other. And in its inability to do so, and this is again all over the world, its inability to do so creates systems where of informality where the people simply ignore the state. And so you have those contestations, and engaging with those contestations take you down another set of dark sides. Pam, sorry. And so the third one for me is a really dark side. And this comes from the end of history, Francis Fukuyama type stuff, where planning is done without ideology. Nowhere in the world where planning systems have been in place have they existed successfully without ideology. And as South Africans, we know about the role of ideology in apartheid in creating the systems. If you look at India, the socialist systems in the independence period, you look at Nigeria, and the impact of those kinds of stuff, the impact of ideology on planning and the absence of planning. And I think that is a dark side that, particularly in the last 25 to 30 years, have really shown planning to be an ineffective instrument in improving people's lives. Because if you look at planning with no ideology, it has led to planning being banal. And you can look at planning and development policy. If you sit in London or Lagos or Laos or Lima, you'd have the same conversation. So planning has been the same wherever you are. And I think that has been a dark side where it's actually been ineffective and undermined livelihoods and things like that. And then I want to bring the last point about the dark side of planning, and that is for planners and planners as leaders, and the leaders in disruption and causing disruption, and the cost of leadership and the cost of being leaders in planning, and the impact that has on the dark side. You follow the dark side like Alice in Wonderland going down the hole, and you don't know where you're going to end up because you are facing interest groups and the status quo all the time, because as leadership in challenging the status quo, you have to deal with the status quo, and the status quo fights back. So those are some of the dark sides that I have picked up, and I'd be more than happy to listen to more people and some of their suggestions on the dark side of planning, and perhaps how we can deal with some of these things. How are we going to deal with this? Do you want to have your hand up, or? Federico, how are we going to deal with this?
I think, yeah, you can raise your hand, or you can also simply unmute yourself and try to and ask or give your comment. The only thing I remind for those who are not speaking, just to unmute yourself, because otherwise it becomes more complicated.
Okay, so I will mute myself, yes. And then whoever wants to come in can just come in, I suppose. Who wants to come in?
It's Yolan Pillay.
Okay, Yolan Pillay.
Hi, I'm from South Africa, Durban. So I think I'm part of the same area where the presentation was made. I work for a consulting company and quite involved in this space in terms of planning. My background is a transport planner. One of the questions that I have, particularly in a city, I think in the case study Durban, we've got various areas within the municipality. So as we've seen in the previous presentation, we have the inner city, but there's other areas within the municipalities that have been earmarked for development, and it's development for more the elite, more upper, higher income. So what we're starting to see is that because the market wants to be in a better place, be it safer environment, more elite in terms of the open space or urban space, we started to see businesses moving out of the inner city itself and moving to these more elite areas. So it goes against what the city is doing in terms of rejuvenating, regenerating the inner city, because the market is saying that we want to be in the more upmarket, call it commercial retail areas where there's the real mixed development, be it residential. So how does one city kind of do both in terms of rejuvenating the old city center and still allowing, for development outside the city? So for me, it's quite, if you look at it at a project level, it's quite easy to develop a project for the inner city. But if you look at a municipality point of view, you're fighting the market in terms of where people want to be or where businesses want to be. So that's quite a challenge. And maybe if someone can shed some light in terms of how this has been done in other countries or cities, I think that would be beneficial.
Okay, Eric Hebrechts.
Yes, I am from Paris region. So just a few points regarding the dark side of planning. Planning is, as you said, it's very complex, but it is the production, because of the standards, are very expensive for a lot of people. And when there is no capacity to produce social housing, planning is creating the condition to exclude a large part of the population. And it is probably the reason of the development of informal areas. That is probably a big concern for a lot of planners. So we can say that the one part of the dark side of planning is the creation of conditions for unaffordable city. And so there is two, so this is one point. The second point is that planning is mainly of the work, most of the work of the planners is related to real estate and to production for formal city. But there is a big impact of the finance economy on the on cities, and with because finance is using real estate as an asset for finance, not for people, and so the in cities, without any utility for cities. I think about empty luxury apartments in London, or ghost cities in China or in India, or a ghost city in Egypt. And as you know, just a few figures, in China, we have about 20% of empty apartments covering China. In Egypt, it's 30%, and that increased from 25 to 30% in 10 years in Egypt. And you know there is a big crisis for housing. So this is a direct effect of Egyptian planning system, which is producing big cities with public money for nobody, and with a big expansion of informal areas in the agricultural land of Egypt, without any effort from the government to, or very few, to rehabilitate this area. So we can say that there is a big relation between planning and one of the dark side of planning is this kind of production, which is in some place really related to the planning system, or very related to the finance economy. And so we can say this is normal for planners to work for this because this is their market. But in the same time, few planners are working on the informal areas, except for rehabilitation. But in the planning, when they are planning new urban expansion, or they don't keep land for the poor. They keep land for roads, for facilities, but not for the poor. And if we consider that we can, when we are designing city, we can produce, put out of the market about 50% of the land for roads, for park, for facilities, why we are not able to keep one part of the land for the poor. And so the planners are not working on that. They are focusing on the real estate market, on the market, but not on the condition for this part of the population. So probably we should reconfigure or reshape our planning mindset, and to integrate other consideration, which is not from the formal system, but to introduce the possibility to produce this incremental city in the planning system. That's it.
Thank you. Incremental city. Anyone else? Anybody wants to say anything? Yeah. Okay, I've got Amit, I've got Samantha.
Yes.
Donald.
Yep.
And Julian, I think, Rambala. So shall we start with Amit?
Thanks. Thank you so much. So firstly, just to give you some background, I work for AYA, Urban Design Studio, and architects. And we were the architects and planners for the point development that was recently completed in the city. But I've also had a background in architecture, working for Alfred Poom Architects for 8 years. And we have done a few buildings in the Durban CBD architecturally in trying to rejuvenate the city, of which 2 of them was Standard Bank and the other was ABSA Bank. And both of these buildings, you know, they had won awards. They were very well accepted, with ABSA being opposite City Hall and the Standard Bank building not being too far away from the ICC. However, despite this, we found that, you know, they still moved out to the north, where I think it was Yolan that mentioned that you find that a lot of these businesses prefer to go to where it's safer and there's a higher quality in terms of space. Therefore, you know, I mean, sitting on both sides, I'm sitting on both sides of the fence, looking at it from an architectural perspective and from a planning perspective. It is a real problem. I'm just opening it out there. What can be done? We've put up 2 multi-million buildings, multi-billion buildings, and even that, you know, it still did not work out.
Okay, Samantha.
Thank you for this discussion. I think, Ashraf, you pointed out 4 really juicy dark sides. That's the reason why I joined this conversation, so thank you for that. I really want to tie in a lot of what I've heard today back to leadership. I think leadership is obviously lacking on a personal level, on a team level, on an organizational level, and a municipal and government level. I think we need to call that out first. So there needs to be some reference to this with regards to education and training, professional training. I think that power dynamics within the municipal and government systems need to be called out and addressed. And by the way, I know I have a very common South African name, but I'm not in South Africa and I'm not South African. I'm actually calling from the Philippines. So I talk definitely about urban areas in the global South when I make all these points. What seems to me as obvious as well is that we need to redefine planning risk in terms of having to look at vast economic risk, for example, from edging out the urban poor who should also have their rights to the city respected in order for economic prospects to actually exponentially develop. This is the fastest way for actually expanding economic prospects for any urban area in the global South. So leadership, for me, is the core aspect of a lot of the things that we're talking about, especially so on a personal level. And the inner work that is required to get to that point needs to be supported by people who actually want the city to develop in an inclusive, just way.
Thank you. Donald?
Thank you. I work for a consultancy, development consultancy. I think my sort of question would be to say, as planners or facilitators of resources, how or what's our role in this power realm where we find ourselves confused in this power ambit? What's our role? Where do we fit in, and how can that actually be resolved? Because we find ourselves in a lot of cases where, you know, statutory-wise, things are supposed to go ABC, but influences, be it political or in other manner, things, you know, goalposts are shifted and things like that. So yeah, it comes back to that question of what can we as urban facilitators do, or what's our role in that space.
Okay. Before I hand over to Julian, and you know, we can have another round of questions after that. I think participants, you should please feel free to jump in and answer those questions. So if people want to respond to any of the points that have been raised by any of the commentators so far, please feel free to do so. It's an open discussion, and there's no resolution that we have to make, and no struggle that we have to wage. So please feel free, and please feel free to disagree if you have to. I enjoy disagreement a lot because out of that comes ideas. So Julian.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you, Adam. It's been fantastic. Thank you for the contributions from everyone so far. My sort of list of the dark side of planning, I think it's part of the problem is that we need to foreground what I would call inclusive innovation. Part of the problem there, or the dark side, is a reluctance to change and a risk aversion that is, I see as a sort of almost a cultural part of the planning landscape. I also believe that we should be really looking at transparency with information and democratization of process and inclusion as potential answers. So although I'm suggesting potential ways forward. I think the lack of inclusive process and transparency, the lack of some ability to really try and drive change leads to some of these darker sides, which include, as you mentioned, elite capture, and even this concept around the sort of end of history planning ideology, planning without ideology. I think we need to be purpose driven around the changes that we want to see. Thank you.
You're on mute if you're speaking, Ashraf.
Okay, I'm going to. Samantha, you need to unmute.
I was just saying that you need to unmute, but we didn't hear what you said because you were on mute.
Oh, my apologies. No. All I was saying is there anyone who wants to? Is there anyone who wants to come in and say anything?
Hi. I just wanted to introduce myself. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm Akanksha. I am from India. I live in Mumbai. I've done my graduation in architecture and post-graduation in urban planning. I'm currently working in a real estate firm. So there was an observation which I have made while during my work. So what I feel is, especially in cities, what people do is, especially poor people, yes, as planners, we need to provide for poor, but what happens is due to the many things that the government does, people have adopted this paternalistic attitude, like because of the attitude of the government, they have adopted this attitude and they do not want to work towards a better life. That's what I've come across. Like there are people who are living in chawls, they want to continue living in those chawls because they know someday a developer would come and will give them houses for free. So that, I think that attitude also needs to change in cities, especially in Mumbai. There is a dearth of land, there is no land. Everything is like all the slums, whatever land is available, it's occupied by the slums. So, and if you want to do a development, you have to give housing for that, and then you develop your own, a part of the land is given to those slum people, slum rehabilitation is done, and then for sale. So there are two components, sale component and the rehab component. What I don't know, as planners, if we can do something to actually empower people to, I don't know, strive for a better life rather than just giving them everything for free. At least what has been done in India. I'm just talking about India. I don't know about other places, but I feel as planners, I think we can do something for that. Yeah, that's what I feel.
Thank you. And now we go to Janisha.
Okay. Hi guys, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so my name is Janisha and I'm from eThekwini municipality. I am a land use management senior technical planner. So basically what I am involved in is the on-the-ground land use management planning that happens within the municipality. So I fall part of a region called the Outer West, and we look at areas like Hillcrest, Gillett, Kloof, and more of your outerline areas like your Hammersdale and Mpumalanga areas. So, you know, a lot of points that were brought up in this discussion was so on point. You know, we look at things like leadership and where we lack and where our leaders lack, and a point of inclusive planning. You know, inclusive planning is something that we've spoken about for years on end. But how far do we actually take this inclusive planning? We have things like public participation where people air their views, but do we really take those views into consideration? Are they really put into place? So my take on this is that I feel leadership and development should work hand in hand, where you have planners or people of planning backgrounds having more influence in higher positions in your governmental states, so that you will have a lot of planning knowledge and background put into decision making when you look at your economy and when you look at development for your country in particular. In terms of people planning, as planners, we always think about planning for the people, but I feel a dark side of the planning is we as planners are very much oppressed by rules and regulations that come from various, from our states, our leaders, our policies. So are we really given the platform to plan and provide for people in a way that's inclusive for all? So yeah, those are my thoughts.
Okay. All right. Would you mind if I just maybe summarize some of the points that were raised and then see if we can get people to respond to that? So it's clear that that people find most of the core aspects of this profession quite dark, and that which should be the basis of planning and democracy and resource allocation seems to be the basic factors which undermine planning and take it into its dark side. And if I could just maybe give you some of the examples that were raised, that there's a conflict between urban renewal and what the market requires, because planning is fundamentally about real estate and how land markets work, and our inability as particularly municipalities to understand the market means that our impact on urban renewal is often limited. And I think quite a few people from different parts of the world in the seminar made that link between real estate, urban development, and market forces, which public sectors don't normally seem to engage in. And in most cases, the colleague from Paris made the point that, in fact, real estate and its role in raising money is often the link. In other words, it's a finance-linked thing rather than it's a finance-linked asset rather than a land being seen as an asset towards the redevelopment of cities as a whole, and so forth. The other issues were safety and perceptions of safety in urban renewal, and the kinds of factors that people don't seem to be taking into consideration when we look at urban planning and urban renewal particularly, and that's the issue of urban safety. And even though it didn't come out in this point, but other people made it, that where you ignore the poor, what often happens is that you're also ignoring basic safety, because it's mostly the urban poor and women and children in urban areas that suffer urban safety issues. And then, of course, many people raise the issue of leadership, that leaders and leadership and development go together, that leadership and teams and organizations and municipal organizations go together, that leadership and power dynamics and the allocation of resources go together. And then what that brings you to is, of course, the redefinition of planning risks, because often, as one of the speakers said, that we don't take into consideration the risks around the way in which we plan and the impact that has on space and the risk that has for urban governance going forward and things like that. And then the role of planners in power is something that really needs to be resolved, as the point was made. But what was quite interesting is the need to foreground inclusiveness. I think that, despite many years of people-led planning and democracy and planning and laws which insist that you must include people and there must be participatory planning, that still seems to be the dark side of planning, in that the people for whom we plan is the approach that we take rather than the people with whom we plan. So we go with suggestions, we go with ideas instead of letting ideas emerge from community participation and so on and so forth. And I think that the whole idea of decentralization, inclusiveness, and transparency is something that the dark side of planning needs to engage with if it is to lighten up. Which brings us to the purpose of planning, which somebody raised. And then that brings us to the colleague from India who says that the government attitudes, both in terms of failing to deliver, but in committing to deliver, creates particular sets of attitudes within people and creates this kind of behavior. It doesn't matter where people go and squat or create slums or create shanty towns. They know that at some point in time, either the government or developers will come and create a situation where they get free housing. So there's an incentive then to promote informality because of the failure of leadership in planning and things like that. So those are some of the points that seem to have been raised. And I was just wondering if that does capture some of the points and if people want to raise other ideas or other suggestions and things like that.
Yeah, we have last 3 minutes, so let's try not to.
Okay. So in the last 3 minutes, I want somebody to say, I want 3 people to say anything controversial around planning. Julian, we start with you. Take us out of the darkness. Take us out of the darkness of planning. And after Julian, it will be Emmanuel.
My point is really just a reply to Janisha. I think she's in India, in Durban. And it's to say, some of the regulations that we work with are really prescriptive. I think there needs to be more flexibility in policy and more transparency and purpose-driven process that's inclusive. And flexible, non-prescriptive regulations and freedom for planners, economists and others to do their work is very important, but obviously around inclusive methods and goals.
Okay, Emmanuel?
What I want to say, first of all, thank you. I joined the session late, but this has been the room I want to be. But what I want to say is we're having a problem because of lack of decentralization of planning and the democratization. Now, if you check, you see that most times, even when you have the master plan, those in the political office holder, they distort it. And oftentimes, you see, most of these distortions has caused flooding and a lot of environmental issues in our cities. So these are issues we really need to look into. And most often, particularly in the developing countries, you see plans going on without the people they are planning for having an idea of what they are doing. This magical approach has to be looked into, because when people understand what you are doing for them, they should be able to have a buy-in, which will make the project beneficial for all. Thank you.
Okay, great. I think that's a good point in which to end. You would have seen we're now moving back to the plenary session. It would have been nice to have to take this discussion further, but I suppose at this level, there's not much that we can do in terms of having intensive discussions, but we will get there. And thank you all for your contributions. We'll see you on the other side.
All right, so welcome everybody, and thank you for joining session 3. My name is Leka Alopi, and I'm a passionate professional planner at the eThekwini municipality. My strengths lie in all facets of planning, particularly regulatory and spatial planning. And my task this morning is to facilitate this session and to introduce our speaker or presenter. So I'm going to start with that immediately, but perhaps also just to let you know that Subs Munsami is also from eThekwini municipality and is part of this team. I'm not sure that Temba is with us, but Temba is also part of my team. So let me now introduce Nathan Iyer. So Nathan is our speaker this morning, and he is the founder of and creative director of Iyer, which is, somebody's got their mic on and I'm picking up some sounds, guys. All right, so he's the creative director of Iyer Planning, Urban Design and Architecture. Iyer itself is an interdisciplinary design studio with major offices in Durban and Johannesburg in South Africa. He's been a lead urban designer on a range of iconic and significant projects in Durban, including the Moses Mabhida Stadium, the precinct itself, the Point Waterfront, Bridge City, and the Canubia New Towns. He's also been involved in work on the Mshlanga Pier and the Go Durban BRT stations and the precincts. And he's currently the lead urban designer for 2 smart cities in Mauritius, which are currently actually being constructed. So that's quite something. Nathan has worked as a designer across the fields of planning, urban design and architecture, and landscape architecture as well. So without saying too much more, let me call Nathan to address us. Thanks, Nathan.
Thank you, Leka, and thanks for that introduction. I'm going to now share my screen. And I'm hoping that everyone can see the cover page, which is Designing Post-COVID City. Is that clear, Leka? Can everyone see that? Okay. Thank you, everyone, and thanks to eThekwini for giving me the opportunity to partner with them in delivering this session. So I'm going to deliver the talk, but Leka's going to answer, and Sub's going to answer all of the awkward questions. So the purpose of the session, I think, as part of the introduction, was to stimulate discussion on the issues of should there be a planning reset given COVID-19, and is density a contributor to the current situation? Now, why is this important? It's important because pretty soon 70% of our global population will live in cities. So the design of our cities, the health of our cities has an incredible impact on the life of all of us, as well as the planet moving forward into the future. So these are the 2 questions that I've been tasked to answer, and I'm going to do it by firstly providing some responses on those larger issues of density and should there be a reset at all. And then I'm going to explore some thoughts and share with you some ideas on how we think a post-COVID city could look like, and hopefully provide some provocations as well. And we want to hear from you, and I think part of this is about starting a dialogue. So on the first question of should there be a reset at all? And I think, could this be considered, and I think some people do ask the question, could this not be considered just another shock to the system of cities? And given that we think about cities in long time frames, 50 years, 100 years, and once a vaccine is found, we would have forgotten about this. Well, I have to say no. I believe that we do need an urgent reset. And not solely as a reaction to this sort of tragic place that we find ourselves, but I think it's important to understand that although this is a public health crisis that's affecting us in cities, that it has to be seen in the context of a series of events that we've experienced over the last 2 decades or so in dealing with climate change. So it must be seen in the context of it being part of a series of responses. And I think importantly, where we really find ourselves now is at the intersection of a public health crisis with an urbanization crisis. And I think we've been talking about this for some time now. There's really a need now to ensure resiliency for various events related to urbanization and climate change. So the second aspect to answering the question of why or should there be a reset at all is to understand that similar events, public health crises have happened in the past, and at every event, there's always been a reset. There's always been some physical or spatial intervention in the city to respond to that particular challenge. And it's interesting when you look back at some of those responses, such as the introduction of sanitation within cities, the introduction of bylaws and so on. The main intervention has always been about public infrastructure. And public infrastructure has been important. So investment in the public good is critical in how these cities have recovered, have prospered, and moved beyond that particular event. So this concept of investing in the public infrastructure of the city to respond to crises is what I want to really explore, and I will take you through a few more issues shortly. The second issue is density. Is it part of the problem? How do we think about density under the current crisis? And the simple kind of view might be that we can't build densities anymore. I think it's a narrow view, and one needs to really question that, interrogate that. So my response is that we need to ask ourselves, is it density that's the issue, or is it congestion? And how do we deal, and a lack of infrastructure support? Is it about misaligned priorities within our city that's the actual problem? We all know that density is critical in ensuring, if you look at city centers, urban areas, they are the most socially diverse, the most integrated. And I think, obviously, from an economic point of view, the most critical in facilitating economic development. But most importantly, I think, we have to ask ourselves the question that, what would the opposite look like? And I would put forward that the opposite of density is far worse than what we're dealing with right now. And this would have a major impact on the future of cities. So imagine if we were to retreat to a low density suburban sprawl, and not just talking about low density, but everything else that goes with that, which means dislocation in our city, which means the loss of habitat, the loss of natural space, the loss of productive space within our city. And imagine if we were kind of now, all of a sudden, start to revert back to this, but do it with a whole lot of more urgency. I mean, that would really set us back several years in terms of promoting sustainable cities. What we do know is that cities consistently remain the engine rooms of our economy, the epicenter of society, of culture, of exchange, and of creativity. Now, all of this is only possible because of density, the ability for us to come together and be creative, and out of that comes economic development. So the reality is we cannot simply move away from density, but obviously we have to acknowledge the crisis we're in. And that would mean we need to start looking towards a new form of urbanism that allows and supports density, but also enables healthy living. So critical to this post-COVID urban future is firstly to understand that it is an urban future, and that there is an opportunity to start looking at this from a reset point of view, and almost starting to reprioritize our needs within our cities. So can we build cities around public space? Can we build cities around car-free zones? Can we build cities around high lines and promenades? And placing emphasis on people and cycling within our cities. These are the conversations that we need to have if we start talking about a post-COVID city, rather than a simplification of density or no density. So this leads me then to the next part of the conversation, which is, how do we start moving forward? What should be the issues on our agenda relating to a post-COVID city? And I think first and foremost, the starting point should be about building equitable cities now. And I say this because if you look at the last couple of months, the favelas of Latin America, the slums of India, the townships and informal settlements of South Africa have been the worst hit by COVID-19. And this is a result of the inequalities in our city. And even more recently, the inequalities in our cities has been evidenced in the US, in the developed world as well. And a lot of the challenges there is about inequality in the cities that the US is currently dealing with. So, there have been several issues that have surfaced during this time that speaks directly to the disparities in our urban system, in our cities, this urban divide. So it's highlighted the inability to social distance, the lack of public infrastructure and places of relief. But also it highlights that poverty fuels greater suffering in these contexts. And I think that's the sad reality of what we've witnessed now in the last couple of months. So another sad and visible reality is the lack of food security in urban areas. And so a post-COVID city must ensure that there are productive spaces that are embedded in the city to ensure that there is food security. So, coming back to why I start here is because we cannot talk about planning resets and so on without us starting to grapple with the structural changes that are necessary in our cities to make our cities serve all its citizens. So it's a wicked problem that we need to deal with a lot of urgency right now. The second theme I want to explore is this notion of embracing biophilia and understanding that the post-COVID city is a green city. And I think it's really interesting to see that even during this time where social distancing was absolutely important, what it's shown us that at every opportunity that people had, they would gravitate to parks. At every window of opportunity, people would go into public spaces, reclaim streets, walk, cycle. So all of that tells us the importance of public space and green space in the city. And the ability to have contact with nature. I think we all know in terms of biophilia that this has a positive outlook. It impacts you positively as a person in terms of your health and welfare. So the post-COVID city needs to be a green city. And I think, how we integrate density and green, I think really is part of the challenge in thinking about it. I think there's a growing consensus that the post-COVID cities are going to be a lot more green. And not just green in terms of energy efficiency, green in a physical way, in a very real physical way. So that's integrating green spaces at different scales, whether it's the facade of a building, whether it's the rooftop garden of a building, whether it's courtyards, or in fact, city parks, large-scale city parks that offer relief and comfort. So if we talk about a reset, then one of the first things that we should be looking at is minimum standards from a planning point of view for green spaces in our buildings, in our cities, and to ensure that we can live in a dense way, in a productive way, but there is relief. So integrating density and green is quite vital. The third element is to understand that the essential infrastructure of the city is the public space. And it's time that we start talking about reclaiming our streets for people. So as I mentioned earlier, every health crisis has always had some significant change brought about by the introduction of infrastructure investment. And I think, we're at a critical point now, at a critical juncture in our cities and the way we think about cities, to ask ourselves, given this health crisis, what would be the public infrastructure or the essential infrastructure of the city that needs to be put in place, which is relevant to this time, and of course, relevant to local conditions and local places and how one adapts that. So we need to start placing emphasis on building cities around the scale and needs of people, as opposed to cars. So this would mean in existing urban centers, more sort of tactical urbanism in reclaiming spaces, reclaiming CBDs for people, reorganizing our streets so that there's more space given over to people to reduce congestion. Can we implement the conversion of streets with great urgency as it's being done in Curitiba? Can we reimagine infrastructure like the High Line in New York, which creates a linear park out of an abandoned piece of infrastructure? So, apart from building or reinvesting in the city, we also have to build new cities, given population demand, urbanization. So imagine, can we build a city on the backbone of a promenade as opposed to a highway? That's essentially what I'm talking about. Can we move people differently in the city? Can we design a city around walking and cycling as opposed to depending on cars? The fourth subject that I wanted to touch on is, the future of workplace. Is there going to be an office of the future? In our recent experience, we've seen large-scale telecomputing, which has led to questions on whether we would need offices in the future. Now, whilst there will be greater flexibility in people having the choice and fueled by technology and assisted by technology to have flexible where you work, where you live, what time you work, and so on. But I would put forward that it's unlikely that the land use typology of office is going to disappear. And one of the main drivers of why I'm saying that, the continuation of the office typology, is that we've seen already a shift towards a more creative culture in the office environment. We've seen the growth of design thinking in corporate culture being adopted as how business is done. We've seen the rise of the chief creative officer as opposed to the chief executive officer. These are all signs that the future workplace is a creative space. And as we know, innovation is driven by creativity, and that's a collaborative process. So despite being able, and I think there's an opportunity in being able to work from home and so on, they would still need a home base, a place where you can be creative. So what does it mean for the future office? It means that apart from social distancing relating to space planning, there's going to be an increase of perhaps external collaborative spaces. We need to find creative solutions that allow us to continue to work collaboratively. So, which then leads me to, if you were to ask me, how do I distill that into key points? And I think the first point towards a post-COVID-19 city is to bring radical change to the public realm, to repurpose, reprioritize the makeup of streets. What exactly does our streets look like? To pursue density, but with the greening of our city. We need to be inventive about our building codes. Let's challenge them. Let's try and see how we don't only focus on the number of cars that you have to have in your building. We talk about the number of spaces and the greening of the building. We need to innovate around a new office model, and I think there's an exciting opportunity. We need to look at moving people differently. And lastly, but most importantly, bring equity into the city for all its citizens. Now, I've gone a step further, and I've put together a diagram, which I've called the 10-minute city, toward trying to understand if we were to build a new place, what it could look like. And how it could be structured. And so what the diagram shows is effectively a 10-minute walk across a city. It starts to show that the main structuring device is the public realm, that the green structure is what structures the future city. And in those spaces, we have recreation spaces, we have places for cycling, for movement, a shift towards what if a promenade and a transit corridor spine became the backbone of this particular city? Around that, you have a central place and so on. I think the diagram itself, I'm not going to go through everything, hopefully graphically illustrates how you build a greentopia, a city of the future. And, just in my concluding comments, while you perhaps look at the diagram, is, as difficult as it is to look for something positive amongst this very sad place that we find ourselves in. But there is a unique opportunity now to bring with agency a reset to how we shape cities and how we recover and prosper from this and how we learn from this. So importantly, I'm sure you would have said to yourself, what's new about this? Because these are the issues we've been talking about for some time. Excuse me, public transport, green space, walking cities. So there's no magical cure or vaccine for the post-COVID city. It is in fact talking about implementing the principles of the sustainable city, except with some nuances now that deals with our behavior in spaces and so on. So, as I say, there's the kind of silver lining and in an almost perverse way, the good that has come out of this is that we can now look at addressing with purpose, with conviction, and seize this opportunity to create the sustainable city of the future. And with that thought, I hand back to Leka. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Nathan. So having heard Nathan's presentation, I'm sure that there are lots of questions, but there's also some very thought-provoking and challenging issues that you might want to raise. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open the session now for questions. If there are any, please raise your hand. I see that they are. Let me just see who they are. I don't have your names. Sorry, perhaps if you just want to unmute yourself. I don't have your names that are popping up on my screen. Now I've got 5 participants. Oh, is this the first one? Aurobindo, are you the first participant that has a hand up? You can unmute your mic and ask your question.
Thank you, Lekha. This is alphabetically, I'm the first one in terms of raising the hand. There were other colleagues as well. It's always a pleasure to attend Nathan's presentation. Thank you, Nathan, for the excellent presentation. My question is around what has been the experience of eThequany or probably from your other projects? Is there a transition from land use to the space use, and particularly in terms of the current, in terms of pandemic experience? Do you think the cities need to go beyond the land use and now move towards the space use? I think it has a lot of implications for the future in terms of planning on all different multifunctional dimensions, and we don't have much experience in terms of moving from land use towards the space use in a citywide experience. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to take 2 more questions before Nathan or the rest of the team provides an answer. So let me ask for 2 other people. Is there a name that's going to appear on the screen for the second person?
So, sorry to interrupt. I think there were 2 questions asked that's in the chat. One by Miriam van Donk, and the other person, sorry, I don't get the name, was about the epidemiologist or epidemiology in planning.
Okay. Was there anything other more to that? Just the epidemiology of planning or in planning?
And the other one was, how do we think about densities and post-COVID planning for informal settlements? If I'm summarizing correctly, Miriam.
Density post-COVID informal settlements. Okay, we've got that one. Thank you. Okay, so who was our second person that had their hand up? Thanks, Subs. Perhaps if you just want to unmute your mic and just introduce yourself, otherwise we're going to have names pop up, which will take too long. So please.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi, this is Sneha, and I'm tuning in from India, from Bangalore. Mr. Nathan, I loved your presentation. I have got 2 questions. India being well known for its density, population, and Bangalore being one of the metropolitan cities, I'm really wondering, and being a land use planner myself and having advocated public transportation all throughout my education and as well as practice, right now those are the things which are shut. So public transportation is a no-no now. Nobody wants to take the public transport system. Everybody prefers to take their private transport, mode of private transport. And I having advocated this, don't have a vehicle on my own, and I'm suffering now because I can't get a cab, I can't get an auto, there are no buses, the metros are off. So what kind of a solution, I mean, what would be the way forward for a scenario like this, considering post-pandemic design? Also, talking about green pockets, what we have is what there is. And if we want to create more, then there's always this question about lack of space. So is there a surgical method that we can have to increase what we have right now? Yes, terrace gardens are one, but my own house, there's just one terrace and so many people. So is there a way that we can bring this as a part of our bylaws? Maybe say there should not be like 1 terrace, maybe 2, I don't know. So what are your views on that? I'd like to hear. Thank you.
Thank you, Sneha. Just a reminder, please, and I'm sorry to do this to you, but you might have seen a little message that's popped up on your screen to say that the session will shut down at 21:25. We actually have 4 minutes. So please, if I could just ask Nathan to maybe provide some input to those answers, because we will automatically shut down. So I'm sorry about this, but it's planned this way. Nathan?
All right, I'll start with some of it, and perhaps Subs can also add from a eThekwini perspective. So I'll start from the last questions and try and move up to the top. I think they're very relevant questions. If the last one dealing with these green pockets, and this is why I say we need to re-examine our bylaws and introduce a code that starts to talk about ensuring that there's a minimum requirement for green space in buildings. The building is designed with an element of relief. The neighborhoods are designed with parks and so on. You know, normally in big projects, the first thing to get cut is the landscaping budget and the parks. You know, so it's something that we need to make sure that we're steadfast about. The second question, or the first one relating to public transport, is a really good question, and it's a challenge, and it starts to talk to the issue of, you know, should we be designing cities on the basis of being able to use the lowest common denominator, walking, to access your needs on a daily basis, or cycling, and hence the idea of the sort of 10-15-minute city. And if people can live in a closed circuit, then there's less dependence on other modes of movement. But the reality is you need to overcome larger distances. And I think that's really the challenge. So how do we travel most efficiently and safely? You know, it's not many people in a single smaller minibus, as an example, but perhaps it is more people in a rail kind of solution, a light rail solution, which has significant space within it to allow for density, for an increase in the number of people. The issue of informal settlement is a real challenge, you know, because these are dense places and there's a social fabric and an economic fabric that's already there. And I think the notion of investing in infrastructure, in creating places of relief, and allowing for, and importantly, some of the challenges in informal settlements and what we've experienced is, yes, it's density, but it's more than that. It's more complex. It's the fact that there aren't potable water. There isn't safe drinking water in areas. You know, so there's a complex history of challenges that has fueled the impact of COVID on that. Subs, do you want to address the others?
I'm not sure if I'll address everything, but very quickly, I think on the public transport, I mean, I'm not a public transport type of person, but you know, having visited India, and you know, I just think there will be room for innovation, whether it is the tuk-tuk system or what you call the auto, or even the motorbike system. But you know, also designing around people getting a lot more things from where they live. So one doesn't need to go all the time to a mall, or yes, you have to go to work in certain places, but where work will change and how it will change, mobility will also shift and change. And I think also getting into public space. I mean, there's not. I mean, we go to malls as we're allowed to go to malls to shop. I've never been, but it's the same thing, and it's just about practicing. At some point in time, we're going to have to practice a lot more cleansing and sanitization and cleaning, which is something very basic if you're thinking about the numbers of people that we're engaging with. Around the informal settlement, sorry if I'm not giving enough attention to it. I think it's a relevant discussion, and maybe we should even flag it as another discussion that we can have more in-depth. But it's really, to me, Miriam, I think many of the informal settlements, there is an underpinning of public space and your main access ways. And if we look at it, we don't really even focus on it. So when you look at the spaces in the areas, you know, those are like in so much dire need for something. And when you think of planning, where the focus has been, it has been on the private sector boundary, on the private sector land owned, and it's something we don't have. We don't deal with urban design, public space, public management within informal settlements, and just getting some of those basics in. And maybe more collaborative in terms with cooperatives, etc., and with what works locally. That will be a way to move in. And then some very basics about what we've seen is you can't get away from a place which doesn't have sanitation or water, be it a school or whatever the case is. So I really think there's some simple wins that we should be making, but also where we focus our attention on. And yes, it has been around numbers and economics, and that won't necessarily change, but we also need to make sure that when people go back into informal settlements, when they go home, when it's Saturday and Sunday, and when you have times like now as lockdown, at least, you should be able to find a space. And I know space is a premium, but it's again about how you champion what is public space for public good. And I think if it's managed like that and not as dead space and criminal space, etc., some of those things will then actually lend itself to be supported and protected. I'm rushing because of time.
Yeah,
But
just one
I think
more
others
comment.
can also answer for that matter, Nathan.
So there's just one additional comment that I wanted to make. When I talk about introducing or greening the city, it's not only about parks and play lots. It's about productive space within productive green space. So we talk about food production. It's also about protecting, and in my diagram, that sort of perimeter of ecological space and natural space as well, and having access to that. So I just wanted to clarify that it's not just about sort of public spaces and green parks. It's also about productive and ecological and natural space as well. Thanks.
So Nathan and Subs, you are in the unenviable position where everyone else is being pushed from the other breakaway rooms into your main room. So shall we give you like a minute just to round it up so we can come back to the main session?
All right. Okay. Thanks, Rihanna. All right, Subs, thank you. Nathan, thank you. I just wanted to ask Ndumiso, because he's from our housing department, whether he had anything to add to Subs' discussion around the informal settlement. And Ndumiso, are you still here?
Good morning, everyone.
Hi. Be quick, sweetie, please, because we need to go back.
Okay, that's a little bit of pressure. But thank you very much. Everything was very interesting. The presentation was very interesting. Even the comments and questions that are coming up from colleagues from across the world, giving us the perspectives of their own experiences in the cities that they live in. Our experience, as Miriam has also asked, the question is just around informal settlements is a big one because of the fact that their density is already there. So then how do you improve that? The one thing that I wanted to sort of just get into our heads to think about was the one thing that Nathan mentioned, was that 70% of people might be living in urban areas or in cities going forward. The one question just around that, or just the one understanding and thinking, especially because it is related to informal settlements, which I'm dealing with currently, is do they want to be in the cities, or do they feel forced to be in cities because of the lack of infrastructure or the lack of social facilities where they come from, especially in the rural areas where they move into cities as a result of? So that's just the one thing, maybe just to put out there.
I'm gonna have to ask Breakaway 3. I'm gonna have to ask you guys to round up, because we really need to get back into the main session. I'm so sorry.
Thanks, Rihanna. No, it's fine. And Ndumiso, thank you for that. But we'll catch up with you post-meeting. Thanks, Rihanna. You can take us back.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. So I think as I will start the session, we're pretty tight on time. So 30 minutes, and then everybody who has been on Zoom is quite a bit of a challenging time frame. So therefore I will delve in. So thanks for joining. Please forgive me. I just recently got a cold. So if my voice is not up to scratch, this is due to health. If I can encourage everybody who joins us to keep your mic muted and apply the same kind of protocols as we had in the main function room, that would be terrific. So what I will do is, before we starting to answer some of these questions, how on earth we actually can maintain proper public life while we're working in an environment with pandemics, I'd like to give you a bit of a theoretical conception, like to frame our conversation, that to really make sure, and I'm sure you're all experts in your own right, that we're all talking on the same page and talking about the same thing. So with that in mind, I just start with that one simple vision. So yes, everybody of us, you know, has a different context. We have different experiences where we work all over the planet. So therefore, it's always really hard to say who is right or wrong. So therefore, we're really going into this conversation with a deep amount of respect, that we know it is simply not as easy, because as there are always different ways to look at the same issue. As these two blokes here, you can see one is both looking at these sticks, and one sees 4 and the other one sees 3. So with that in mind, and I'm also personally quite interested in to learn more about what happens in Durban, given that I have just experienced in terms of work in West Africa. So I'm pretty eager on that. So let me start by with going into the conversation with the broadest policy framework which we have, which really summarize and captures well what we are all in for here. So the New Urban Agenda, as it has been finalized in 2016 at the Habitat 3 conference, is literally the shared vision of all our cities around the globe. And I just like to highlight point number 11 here, as it really captures and really entails and comes together in the public space. And that is, please let me read that to you, is a vision for cities for all, to ensure that all inhabitants of the present and future generations, without discrimination of any kind, are able to inhabit and to produce just, safe, healthy, accessible, affordable, resilient, and sustainable cities. So if you're interested in that kind of policy document and you haven't had a look into this, please do so. Some of you might think, how on earth does that link up, for example, with the Sustainable Development Goals? I also included a link down there where Compass Housing in Australia really made all this hard work to bring it together and translated the SDGs into the New Urban Agenda, which helps you to frame also a policy discussion in your respective city. So the whole New Urban Agenda is really a tale of what are we really in for, and what kind of cities are we aspiring to design in the next 20 years. So yes, we heard already in the Durban context, mobility is a very important part. And so therefore, I brought a couple of facts here together, but I'd like to emphasize the 3 bold parts here. This is one because they really come together in public space. There is public transport and eco-mobility, which entails walking, active travel modes such as cycling, and also having good mobility choices in convenient distance, which very much is closely linked to connectivity, as we already heard earlier today. Biophilic design is really how we can enable contact with nature wherever we actually design urban systems, and open spaces such as this should be really embedded as part of this whole vision. And also I'd like to point particular out the effect of social cohesion and inclusion, that really public spaces in its most genuine form are therefore interaction to celebrate local culture and are accessible to everybody. And that allows not just resource-rich minorities, but very much it's also all vulnerable community members and are a showcase scenario for spatial or social justice. Often we know we are sitting now in terms of unprecedented challenges ahead, so which calling for options of how do we on Earth design something tangible, integrated, which really makes a difference in the near future. That comes back to co-design, co-production, to co-create these kind of spaces. I also put a couple of scholars there in case you would like to do more readings on that. So coming to our small conversation, and to come into the point here, we're really talking, if you talk about SDGs, about the sub-target 11.7, that by 2030 we provide universal access to safe, very important, inclusive, accessible, green and public spaces. So how on earth can we do this now, since we all experience this kind of pandemic? Just before we really trying to answer that kind of question, I'd like to highlight and clarify simple, what is public space, right? often we're hearing different terminology. For example, some of us very much using the term of public realm, some really focus on the public space. So this kind of spatial representation of these kind of hybrid zones where the private and the public really ends has been captured here in this kind of graphic very well. So when we truly talk about the public space, that doesn't necessarily talk about the interface with the building. However, often we as planners, we have to really think about even the interface of the buildings, because on ground level, that's where most of the social life happens, and that's where it's incredibly crucial for the human experience of an urban environment. So please keep that in mind. And as Jan Gehl already said, you know, if we're trying to define public space in its easiest term, it's everything between buildings. Yeah. And if we take that entails different kinds of typologies ranging from plazas, squares, streets, laneways, bike lanes, footpaths, medium strips, community gardens, playgrounds, play space, dog parks, arboretum beaches, vacant land even, formal parks and open spaces, post-industrial landscapes, and even third spaces. Oh, whoever put on the microphone, would you mind? Thank you so much. And the third, also some of you had probably the terminology about the third place. That is entails spaces which are literally not places where you're at home or at work. So this can be even places such as libraries or cafes where people meet, and often there are some kind of public space. Particularly now, since we all experience this pandemic, even our private homes somehow become now part of the shared experience, and I share my office with everybody around the globe. So therefore, we have to think about how we really even reframing and almost talking about deterritorialization of public space in this modern time. So with that in mind, I come to my to end for my context to this conversation, what we're going to have. I know everybody probably has heard that quote from Jane Jacobs before. Cities have the capability of providing something for everybody, only because and only when they are created by everybody. More though, I would like to, in a more thought-provoking way, also share with you the second quote from Louis Mumford, in which he's written in The Culture of Cities. And I read it out to you. The city is a fact in nature, like a cave, a run-off, a mercury, or an ant heap. But it is also a conscious work of art, and it holds within its communal framework many simpler and more personal forms of art. Mind takes form in the city, and in turn, urban form conditions the mind. So what he really entails, what we're talking about, if we want to create public spaces where everybody can thrive, and these are the lifelines for everybody in a post-COVID-19 world, we really have to think about how on earth are we really understanding the people who are using it, and how on earth can we really create and accommodate experiences which are fulfilling and have something for everybody. Personally, my research interests, I focus on children, hence why I put this kind of image in here. So please be part of this conversation for the remaining time. We're trying together to answer these two questions. How can public spaces adapt in the times of uncertainty? And will we be able to reclaim them after our quarantine restriction? How that might look like. The second question is, we know location, scale of public space matter, particularly in this different context, as well as their contribution to more resilient, inclusive, and just cities. So the question here is, what kind of role will public space have for the next inner city making? With these two in mind, concurrent, as perhaps not everybody will be able to speak, I would like to share with you this link. And you're encouraged to go into this document and very much, and I posted in the chat room function, engage in this kind of manifesto and put in what you think public space in a post-COVID-19 world should look like, and how we can co-produce safe and just spaces. So with that in mind, I'd like to ask you to pose questions in the chat room function, and then with the support of my background, oh yeah, there you go, with Cindy, we would like to then, when you pose the question, I'd like to hand over to you, and then you can unmute your micro and share microphone and share with you the observation. So please feel free to access this document link and also appropriate your, yeah, we need access to the document. Yeah, it should be an open access document. So if you click simply, it should be accessible to everybody. In case it does not work, then please you need to let me know again. It should, this document looks like this. And we have certain paragraphs in there highlighted, and feel free to include what public spaces must include and what we as a collective would believe in. Oh, it's asked with request access. Okay, please, then I try to share that again. Okay. Okay. I will share that again, please. There you go. Try that one. Working now. Perfect. Thank you so much. So feel free to capture your insight there and also to ask some of these questions. As part of the conversation so far, maybe until you formulate your first question is, or your observation in your respected country is that in each country experience the impacts of COVID-19 in different ways in public spaces. Some of them, they cut already the curve and coming out very well now. Other countries really still struggle and suffer to unprecedented scale. What it really did is it showed some of the deficiencies in our systems, and we as professionals can ask ourselves, what are we really facing and how can we respond to that? Okay, here are the first two questions. So the first one, what is the role of open space to promote social interaction during pandemics? And the second one is the concept of the compact city form relevant in sustainable cities during the pandemic in high density areas of the worst, and they are the worst affected. These are two very varied questions. Let me and by all means, I don't need to necessarily answer all of them. These are open questions to everybody, and I will share them in this on the PowerPoint slide that everybody can see them, and you can feel free to, oops, hold on, this was the wrong link, to respond to that as well. Hold on. Ah, doesn't work. So hold on, maybe. So the first, coming for the question, let's talk about the first question. What is the role of open spaces to promote social interaction during during these pandemics? So what we have experienced in certain country, oh, forgive me, I have to do that. To edit this, just share with me. Okay, hold on. So this should hopefully work now. Thanks. Does it work, everybody? Yes? Okay. So coming back to the questions. So yeah, here we go. We've got some of the responses. Could you please, Temba, unmute your microphone and share with us your question as well?
Thanks, Gregor. Yeah, I think as you've sort of alluded to, COVID and the pandemic is really highlighting some of the pertinent issues, and it's highlighting the importance of public space. But in South Africa, that also means highlighting the inequitable access to private space as well as to public space. And so what can we do about this physically? I know some cities in the world are doing things like pedestrianizing some roads and trying to use different types of spaces as new open spaces. And then beyond that physical side of things, as digital space becomes more important in terms of public space, how can we sort of deal with some of the inequitable access to digital and online access?
Yeah, thank you, Temba. These are both very well observations, particular when we're talking about access in this kind of environment to internet, which is also not equitable, shared by everybody, and no one has good internet per se. Particular when you talk about people that live in perhaps informal settlements and they really have only their mobile phone to enter to take part in that digital space, how often that doesn't really proper work in that sense. It's really pressing. Also, and you pointed on that some of these cities around in Europe or even New Zealand, they are closing streets down to temporary and to accommodate the physical distancing between the people to experience and to access necessary services in the city. So this is one way, but also what it showed is, and that comes back to the first questions which we had earlier, it really highlights how important neighborhood open spaces and green spaces in nearby where you walk really are. So often what we've learned in certain parts of the world that we all put a lot of energy in maintaining big park systems with high quality infrastructure. But now by experiencing this hyper localized existence, we're really starting to see the value in having access to spaces nearby. Michael, would you like to have a go and share your observations, which you've shared already in the chat function?
Yeah, I was simply making the comment that in South Africa, in many cases, public space is pretty poorly designed for the pedestrian and the cyclist and so on. And under COVID, in the South African context, as communities, we were only allowed to go for walks or exercise in our immediate vicinity. And whether somebody was in the inner city of Durban or in a suburb, the public realm isn't designed for non-motorized transport, cycling, or pedestrian transport, and that's certainly a huge disadvantage in the South African context. But everybody had to just adapt, and yes, there is risk where we're now sharing the streets with motor vehicles, taxis, buses, trucks, etc. But people needed to use the public realm. So there is a real need to reinvent the public realm for non-motorized transport, both pedestrian and cycling in the South African context. And then secondly, with regards to what's the future of densification in a compact city, I think we'll always have the risk of transmission of communicable diseases having a higher risk in the compact city. But I think the benefits of the compact city can't be discounted, because in the compact city, all the other critical elements of access to various levels of service, improved access to live, work, play, etc., I think ultimately will trump the risk of communicable diseases. And also your levels of service theoretically and access theoretically should be improving if we allow a level of service which is accessible to all within the compact city. But in our South African context, we certainly don't have a compact city in the true sense, so the inequality is still very prevalent. But I think the theory, although it's not, the practice is not a reality in our country yet, in South Africa yet, the design philosophy of a compact city, I believe, is still something we should all strive towards. Thank you.
Thank you. Very well done remark. I'd like to hand over all the way to Puna. You just raised your hand, so please, and then after that to Mirami. Thanks.
Yeah. I have recently done a case study on the public spaces, particularly how the small parks in the residential areas, how important they are and how accessible they are to people, right? So, but a very important thing that, these public spaces, if they are, if the colony, it's a planned area, if it's a planned residential area, then these public spaces are part of planning and they are there, accessible, developed for the people. But in many of the cities, they just grow unplanned. So the unplanned urbanization, so my study says in the unplanned urbanization, there was no park per se. So it was just a jam-packed residential concrete area. And in terms of the access to for people to to kind of basic well-being, this was not available at all. So for me, how I related to that living in the same city, in the same city, and the city of course says the per capita income of the city is that, but in the same city there are colonies which are absolutely unplanned and no accessibility, right? And of course this do raise another issue, that yes, the income brackets are really important, which is also, we can see the impact of people lying in what income bracket and what kind of public spaces are accessible to them. So the socio-economic categorization of the gentrification of the society is also an important aspect which we really needs to understand. This is one aspect that another in the particularly, that how these spaces are one is accessibility. Two, in my study I also concluded that these small green patches, parks are basically small green patches within the concrete area. These small green patches of course have a microclimatic impact on the local areas. So that's really important. And this microclimatic impact, of course, it is directly influencing the well-being of the people.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you.
I couldn't agree more. Thank you. Very well remarks and very spot on. I'd like to hand over to Mirami. I hope I pronounced it right. Thank you.
Yeah, see. Hello, everyone. Okay, from my opinion, public space, I believe they are important for everyone for maintaining stress and negative issues related to health, according to news and numbers for new cases and numbers of death and etc. So public space will enhance this, but in the same time, precautions have to be taken for meters, and even if we are using alcohols and sprays, it can be bad for public spaces, which can evolve the problems and maintaining the issue. But overall, it can be a good sign for inspiration system and immune system if we have precautions out there. In case of second question for compact cities, increasing risk, yeah, it increasing risk, but in the same time, it increases the awareness for safety and how people can, mainly in compact cities, people are not having public space as mentioned by other colleagues, but they have to see and try to to check how they are each other without keeping distance. Even there are no public space, they started to add new habits like trying to cleaning roofs and doing activities for upper houses, trying to all there are no gym public public clubs, so they started to doing exercises in roofs, in balconies, sharing together with keeping the distance, because they are knowing that compact cities are more are more promote more increase, and they have some increase for risk of transmission than the spaces are not compact at them, so it can help their awareness. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for this contribution. Just while you were saying it, certain things come to my mind, particularly around safety. Also, what we have to be mindful of, that we're always talking about two types of safety. There is perceived safety and real safety, yeah, which we had in a pre-COVID-19 world as much as we do now in between while we're dealing with it. And unfortunately, the deficiencies are really often now show and come out in urban systems, in particular when you talk about it, let's say in association to compact living and overcrowding of certain spaces, right? And then we talk about transmission rates between people. So how do we on earth mitigate that and create that? And I presume I would like to throw it back to the collective is how might we as planners and designers be able to respond that as we're already moving forward and now starting to think about, we have to think about that pandemics will come in future again. So how do we build that into our conscious thinking and practice as part of our everyday life? Okay, yes, please. And then I'd like to hand over to Noma. Hold on, sorry. There's first, I have to go back. So the first person, the next one is Bongu Musa. I hope I said that right. Please, over to you, followed by Noma and then Shazad. Thank you.
Thanks. Sorry, it's also Ayanta who raised her hand some time ago.
Oh, sorry, I didn't see that. Okay, please, then she's first, yes.
Okay, thanks, Greg. I mean, I think the one contribution that I wanted to make is an obvious one, which I think most of the colleagues will have identified, that during this pandemic that we are in, and when the country is gone lockdown, is when we realize, I think at the greatest level, the need and the value of the public space. Even when you live in a high-rise building, that you needed a space where you can at least go out and walk if you want to work, or even sit and do passive recreation and read a book if the need be, even taking the webinar like the one we are attending. But there are also things that we then need to look at in the case where we have got in the CBD, where we have got residential flats and offices, multi-use building. And then if you look at the public spaces we have, we need to revisit how we plan even the roads. I mean, in some cities, for example, we have got a main road in the CBD with 4 lanes going one direction, with parking spaces on both sides. Really, do we need that particular provision for the cars? And then we need to visit that and then think about the cities for the people rather than the cities for the cars, and allow the convenience of the people to use the public space while allowing also the cars to move people and goods freely in a particular way. I think that's a thing that we need to consider. Of course, I do agree with Norma when you look at the typology of the web as a public space where we can engage and then of course have different experiences of that. But again, I think there's an opportunity that is presented to us by COVID, that we can revisit how we've been doing things and maybe leverage this and then do more in what we've been.
Yeah, thank you so much for your contribution. Particularly when you think about the web also as a new typology for public space, almost I can't help but to think about the concept of right to the city, because if public space is usually a space for everybody, and then it becomes almost a human right conversation we should have. In Noma, I think if we touched on your point, I would like to hand over to Jazat and then over to Ali. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, hi. Hello, Greg. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, hi. So I would like to highlight 2 important aspects of public spaces in relation to the peoples and in relation to the COVID. The very first is like if I talk about India, during the time this COVID pandemic started and the government of India started lockdown process, there were some protests going on against some policy issued by the government, and those protests were mainly on the main roads and streets, organized by some universities and some communities. So the cities in global south, you see the roads are the main public spaces, and in terms of protest, like in terms of activities where people are protesting, because in a democratic setup, protest is equal to a right, and there is a spatial connection with where you are protesting and for whom and for against whom you are protesting. And this protests like the use of spaces, and the protest is also linked with what is happening around in America nowadays on the Black Lives Matters. So the roads are essentially, due to this COVID-19, the cars are off the road, and the public and the streets have become new public protest sites. But interestingly, the government is unable to hold any lockdown provisions, like you have to maintain social distancing or physical distancing on the roads in terms of protest. So the government has, like, they are not in a capacity to withhold the lockdown rules because of the fact that people are protesting on the roads. So that this is one aspect. Another aspect is of the streets in global south is, in India, roads are marked with signages of to maintain the 6 feet distances as a response of tactical urbanism. But it would be very interesting to see when currently India is now unlock phase 1 has started, and everything is started opening, and I see a complete erosion or no layer of that tactical urbanism or those spaces markers. We are now not being followed. So the public streets and then the spaces are back to what they are in the previously normal conditions.
Yeah,
so this is one of the shift that the planners needs to understand, that if they are going back to the previous normals, then what would be our learning and what would be our preparedness for the any unfortunate COVID-like condition in the future. That's all.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. That really, appreciate it. Ali, over to you. Thank you. And then after this, Ayanda, right? Yeah. Oh, sorry, Cindy.
To add that we only have 4 minutes left, and we need.
4 minutes left. Okay, very good. Then we have to be brief, but I still like to give our people which put their hands up and were so patient the chance. Ali.
Yeah, sure. I just need to stress the political significance of public spaces. And I want to also relate it to what's happening in the United States now, which is spreading all over the place. I think in our modern time, we have different kind of forms by which people would enjoy outdoor activities, would enjoy waterfronts, would enjoy parks. But I think public space, by definition, even if we trace the historical evolution of public spaces from the time of agoras and forums and plazas and sahas in Muslim cities and so on and so forth, we would realize that it's a space for people to come together and express their existence. So I think looking at the political dimension of public spaces are also fundamentally important and so much related to what is happening in our world now, because I think also web public spaces or virtual public spaces are not going really to respond to those issues, particularly if we also consider how many people have access to the internet. And therefore, if we are concerned about what Jane Jacobs said, or the whole notion of just city, then we need also to reconsider and revisit our holistic understanding of public spaces. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Ali. I think that you're absolutely spot on. We have to have definitely an active discourse around that as a community. I'd like to, I'm mindful of time, I'd like to hand over to Ayanda, I think, if I spelled it correct, or said it correctly. And then unfortunately, we're running out of time. We have to conclude. However, I encourage you to leave a comment in the document as well. Thank you.
Hi, thanks, Greg, and thanks, everyone. I think for me, the crisis has put a spotlight on societal inequalities, but also worsened some of the existing challenges that face vulnerable groups in cities. And these are not new things, it's things that we knew all along, but the crisis uncovered them. So I think when it comes to public space, I think we need to rethink how we design and we plan public space, taking account the needs of vulnerable groups in cities. I think it's something that we need to do. So I think as cities across the globe, as they begin to reopen, how do we use the opportunity? How do we use the crisis, as Mungumusa is saying, to carry out those things that we previously thought about as impossible? Things like how do we involve homelessness, and how do we think about informal workers, informal recyclers when designing and using public spaces? Because now I think this momentum is showing that those things are feasible or are necessary. Thank you.
Absolutely, thank you so much, Cindy. I'm not sure how we're going on time. Probably we're at the end now. Am I right?
Yeah, in order to give time to everyone to switch back to the previous link, so we can enter the main room. Maybe we have to close it now.
Okay. Yeah.
I will need to remind you that we need to leave this room and then go back to the first link that we had at the very beginning.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. So I'd like to thank everybody for this brief conversation. And really, we just touched the surface level here. And I very much hope actually this is just the start of a conversation with our community. And please, I'd like to encourage you to continue to make contribution in the document, which we will share with ISOCARP and everybody who is interested to take the conversation forward in your respected city or as a global collective. So with that in mind, please leave this conversation here and return to the room. Thanks for listening and tuning in. Thank you.
The standard operating procedures that would have to be amended or that have to be developed in order to implement them. In other words, when somebody comes to work, you say, "What? Here's your new standard operating procedure because this new activity has now been added, and this is what needs to happen, and it is part of the record." Similarly with budgeting, that there has to be the top team, or the EXCO as I would call it, has to ensure that there is budget for all of the activities over the 3-year period that we normally budget for the particular project. Now, if those things don't happen, then everybody will sit back and say, it is planning's job. Planning must do all of that. But planning cannot do all of that because planning is not in control of all of that. So because those things has to happen, it is really important for the senior management in a municipality, I'm talking about the top management, to take that kind of responsibility. That's my short version. I can't go on for everyone as well.
Okay, thank you, Johan. I think you mentioned really some nice stuff. I know we can all go on and on for an hour because this is such an interesting topic, and we are all, as I can see here, really planners who are working for different municipal bodies and planners working for different levels of national and regional planning. So I think we all feel that pain. Personally, I'm also getting a bit tired of, blame the planner game in this setting when planners get caught between the politics and the demand for the implementation, and the demand from different stakeholders and demand from the commercial stakeholders, and if something goes wrong, blame the planner. That's something that we need really to we need to fight for a better position of our profession, let's say. And as you said, the planning cannot do everything, but we have to kind of reinvent ourselves, and as someone mentioned before, to turn the table, maybe to really look deeper into what is our role and how can we be most effective in all of this. Are there some other questions from the colleagues? We have another 5 minutes, and then we will be automatically asked to leave the room. So please, if there are some other questions and comments, just unmute yourself and present them.
Yes, my name is Eliezer Gomet, and I'm a town planner here at the City of Johannesburg, working for a private consultant, Edward Fadanline, an associate. So I would like to just add my contribution on what was discussed here. And there's a point that I really loved when Mr. Johan spoke about not being naive when it comes to politics and its involvement into planning, because we know our national plans are really good, but they are too broad. And as the colleague just said, it needs to be a bit narrowed into our municipalities level. But this cannot be done if we are not in accordance with our politics, so which are the ones basically set budget and everything. So I think we really need to look at how do we link our plans to the political will, if I may say so. And that will be the only way for us to succeed in the implementation of our plans. Because if we just go toward the need of the population and ignoring the politic above, we will always find ourselves into a box where we can't really act. Thank you.
Thank you, Elise. This is also very, very important. The scope of planning. You know, sometimes we still operate within the laws of the 50s and 60s, especially in Eastern Europe, when the planning laws structure has not been really updated and not very much up to the standards. So it stays and needs of the modern planning. So it's you know, kind of having this very broad framework without really defining what can happen and defining what are the responsibilities for some smaller frameworks. And that's even the problem in the rest of Europe, not only in East Europe. It's a reoccurring problem in the planning, I think. Do we have some other comments as well? Yes, Sinisha, you want to say something? No. Please unmute yourself.
Oh,
Just one
I'll unmute again.
Yeah.
Sorry, are you speaking, Milena, are you speaking to me?
No, I'm speaking to someone else, but
okay.
That person needs to unmute. Oh, can we hear you? No, we can't hear. Anyway, okay, we need to wrap up. Sorry. So I would say I have three important points I will bring back to the plenary. One point is working towards change and working towards political change and how to leverage on political change. Owning the policy is one of the important points, and another point is horizontal integration of different stakeholders within the planning process. Those are the points I'm going to bring back to the plenary, and I think we have already got the invitation and we can return to the main session. So let's do that. Thank you all for the participation. I think this was really a great session. It's been recorded. We will share the reports, and please stay connected with us. Thank you.
We're literally going to give each of the session rapporteurs 3 minutes just to give us a flavor of some of the key issues that happened in your breakaway session. So Siwe, Kyla, Prashina, over to you. Kyla, I think you're reporting back. If you just give us a sense, planning practices in times of flux, what was the key issues? Your 3 minutes.
Thank you, Rihanna. So this session, entitled Planning Practice in Times of Flux, which was hosted by SALGA and the South African Cities Network, started with a presentation from Prashina Mohangi from SALGA that really highlighted the manner in which this period of COVID-19 has brought to the fore the stark polarities that exist in South Africa. And as planners, we know we're working in a context of extreme inequality of service delivery, infrastructure, and space. But COVID-19 has really shone the light on this, perhaps like never before. So Prashina outlined that what is required now more than ever is for leadership to be woke and alert to the injustices in our environment, and for planners to take on a much more activist role. So instead of blaming others, politicians, managers, communities, we really need to look deeply at ourselves as planners to understand that change starts with our own practice, and that we can and must be leaders too. So through referencing some of the work that both SALGA and the South African Cities Network have done on understanding the human behind the planner, we were then led into the discussion about really what I as a practitioner can do differently in my own practice to affect change in this context of extreme polarity. The discussion was facilitated by Siwe Ntombela, a researcher at SACN, and focused on issues of how to best serve the people we are contracted to serve. The question was posed, what has had to change in our own organizations to adapt and respond to the pandemic, with the example given by Siwe that planning colleagues have been able to greatly increase the turnaround time to develop and pass new policies and plans during this time, which has of course been necessary in this context of extreme scarcity, with certain communities without access to basic services such as water and sanitation. And while the argument was made by colleagues in the room that processes using social media and online communication is becoming the prevalent method of communication, the challenge was also raised that there is a pervasive lack of access to data and connectivity, especially during this time, as many people have moved to more rural areas and away from the urban centers. The point was also made that when everything is shut down, food, medicine, and ICT continue. So when we're doing our policy thinking, we need to consider this and understand the importance of these sectors. A recurring theme was that we need to support the private sector. And as we acknowledge the strain that businesses are under.
You can draw it to a close, please, Kyla.
Okay, sure. Basically, I think that the key takeaway is that the idea of planners as activists resonated really strongly, with many constraints being discussed, such as a very sensitive political administrative interface. But ultimately,
okay, Kyla, I'm gonna have to cut you.
That's fine. Thanks, Rihanna.
Thanks. We're gonna move to Ashraf, the dark side of planning disruption. Your 3 minutes start now, Ashraf. Ashraf, will you just give us a sense of what happened in your session? Okay, we're going to come back to Ashraf if he's not ready. The team that I cut.
I'm here. Oh, sorry,
Are you there?
I'm here.
Okay, sorry, you were probably on mute. Okay, Ashraf, your 3 minutes start now.
Okay, so the issues there were 6 issues. One is the dealing with market and urban renewal and understanding the role of the market and real estate in urban renewal, and that we need to begin to understand the role of the finance economy in urban development and urban renewal, because the role of finance and real estate go together. Safety and perceptions of safety in urban renewal were raised, and the fact that planning often ignores the poor and the marginalized and looks at formality rather than informality as a component of urban development. The need for leadership across all, as planners, but also in terms of organizational development in municipalities, engaging with the power dynamics, and in that way redefining planning and planning risks and so forth. And then understand in that context the role of planners in power and the allocation of resources. Fourthly, the need to foreground inclusiveness. In other words, to take much more seriously decentralization, inclusiveness, and the need for planning to be a lot more transparent in its allocation of resources. And so, fifthly, a government patronization where it says, look, we will do things, but then fails to do things and causes an urban system collapse. And then what happens in a case like that is you find rent-seeking behavior amongst people, knowing full well that if they occupy marginalized spaces, that when development does happen, that they will be getting free houses. And then finally, the need for flexibility and transparency in the regulations and laws which impact on planning and the planning system. And part of the decentralization should be seen in the flexibility. So those were the 6 big items that need to take us out of the dark side of planning. Thank you.
Thanks. May there be light, Ashraf. Can we then move to Leka and Nathan, that big session that was happening in the main room when we kind of just stormed in there?
Okay, great. Thanks, Rihanna. So we're going to make 4 points for the board. The first one is that obviously in resetting ourselves going forward, we need to have a set of minimum standards for green spaces. And this will provide some kind of relief in density, because we ask the question, is it about density or is it about congestion? And in bringing some of the relief to what we know to be density, perhaps the greening option is the way to go. The second point that we want to have captured is that obviously looking at the infrastructure of the city as it stands right now, there's a need for more public spaces. And these public spaces are important for us to reclaim our lives and the way we function as a city. So importantly, to have investment opportunities that allow for this infrastructure to happen. So as much as you want to plan on a plan to say this is a green space, have the infrastructure that makes it happen. Let it be a reality. We want to also record the importance of reclaiming CBDs. Right now, we see that traffic plays a very important role in our cities. Rather, it should be around pedestrianization, non-motorized traffic, such as bicycles, etc. So we'd like to raise the point of reclaiming cities and converting our streets into more usable spaces, and to build cities on the backbones of things like promenades and open spaces rather than that of freeways and main streets. The fourth point that we'd like to have captured, please, is the future of the workplace. And the question that we're asking is that as much as we've had COVID and every one of us has been given an opportunity at some time to work from home, that's possibly the way of the future. But having said that, we believe that the land use offices is not going to disappear completely. It will have a role to play. But how then do we reinvent these office spaces into more usable spaces? I think those are the 4 points, Rihanna, but I think importantly to also raise that there needs to be some innovation around the existing building codes, which are not flexible enough. We also need to look at the equity within the city to make sure that
Leka, 1 minute.
Have access to social facilities and all other facilities to make life more comfortable. I'll leave it for there, and I hope I captured it, guys. Thank you.
Thanks, Leka. Colleagues, I am noting that obviously there's some debate being raised in the chat. Obviously, this session is not going to be able to open up further some of those debates. I think they are interesting issues, and we'll find a way to move them forward if they're going to be subsequent sessions. Greg, over to you, Breakaway 4.
Thank you. I just summarize it very briefly. So we had a bit of a context which I provided in the beginning, where we make sure that we are all understanding what public space as a concept really means. So with that in mind, we really touched on a plethora of different angles, because public spaces is quite complex. And I'm grateful that already people in our previous groups touched on so many valid points, particularly around access and pedestrian and cycling to these. So what our group has done is we invited the participants also to create some kind of manifesto in a separate document, which I'd like to share then following the session with everybody. And in that document, we touched on certain parts, for example, that public spaces must be inclusive and safe and accessible for all. And then we covered some of the attributes which we thought we really believe and share with everybody. So for example, there is what kind of value public space really offers and what it can provide to everybody. We know this is culture specific as well, and we have to be very mindful of designing in an inclusive way, which almost comes back to an awareness that we really value now public space and really be conscious about how we co-create meaningful experiences in which people can really flourish. We also need to consider tactical urbanism and temporary uses much more carefully, and really think about the way how we cater for pop-ups, for example, for food courts and all sorts of other places which can happen in public spaces. Interestingly, and that I think was novelty, we briefly touched on the political dimension of public space, and that has to be really part of this contemporary conversation. As we know, it's spreading around the world now that societies really stand up and saying spaces are for everybody there as well, and they're using public spaces to express themselves. So the political dimension is very important. And we even thought, I'd like to finish probably on that note, is we touched on the importance of considering even the web and having access to internet maybe as a kind of public space as well, particularly in times of pandemic. Yeah, that is very much up for discussion, but because it links it directly into almost a human right conversation. How can we ensure everybody has data and access to that to take part in the city making processes? So yeah, I would leave
Thanks,
it
Greg.
at that. Share the documents later.
Thank you very much. Johan and Milena, the final session on the national perspectives.
Yes, thank you, Johanna. I will try to summarize it in a 3 or 4 points. It was really nice discussion that we had about, you know, how can we make better national planning? What are the roadblocks? What are the hurdles that we experience right now in South Africa, but also all over the world? Well, there are 3 possible directions we identified as ways to go next, or ways to go after the pandemic, or in general ways to go in these times of uncertainty. And that is to try to mitigate political instability, which is influencing planning process. And now on top of that, we also need as planners to mitigate all other instabilities coming from the pandemic. And somehow we need to see it as an advantage in a way, and try to turn the tables and initiate the change, because that's something that is very much needed, obviously. And pandemic has opened many eyes and many possibilities to do things differently. So let's try to do it, see it as a chance. The second point that was raised by one of the colleagues who took active part in this session was, we do have national policies. We have troubles with implementing national policies. And when it comes to municipal level, we need to own the policy. National policy needs to be owned by municipalities, and also by all the departments of the municipalities, in order to be better implemented. And the third point that was coming out of that one, raised by Johan, but also by other colleagues, is how the need to work on horizontal integration in planning. So not just let's say looking from top down, bottom up in that way, but really try to make better plans horizontally and through cross-sectoral collaboration. In this last point, one of the important questions that was raised was, of course, the need for new ways of leadership, and that's something that it's been mentioned already in session 1. And what is the role of planners in this new leadership? And I would like to conclude that we definitely have a bigger role to play in the future as planners. Thank you, Rihanna. Back to you.
Thanks, Milena. So colleagues, it's been a rich discussion, both in the chat, from the breakaway rooms, everything from the personal to the political, to the placemaking, to the people. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Subs to close the session. But just to thank you all for your active participation in the breakaways, and from some really provocative issues, I think, that have been put into the chat in the last couple of minutes. Subs, over to you. Subs, just remember to unmute yourself.
Hi, everyone. Greetings and thanks, Rihanna. I wanted to say from a warm Durban morning, but it's already afternoon. So I hope it was at least exciting enough and people had some fun. And I think if you leave with more questions than answers and feeling uneasy, then I think that is part of what the job is well done, because change in some ways have to make you feel uneasy. And this is not a woman question, but it's changing in all sorts and forms. It also indicates one is grappling and one is rethinking and one is trying to reshuffle and actually sometimes just change totally in terms of what we want to do and what we think works and which doesn't work. I think I'm just trying to also rush. I've never felt this rushed in a long time, but a disruption we're facing, The question is, how do we move ahead with that disruption? We can make it a positive one, or we can make it a negative one, and we can go back into standardizing planning and standardizing for ultra safety. And yet we know that the poor will find themselves living in marginalized spaces, because not everybody can have access to spaces in a way our basic standards, etc., will eventually dictate. So we need to be a lot more flexible around that. I know my discussion was around the, so my job here today is fairly easy. I'm just going to now jump into the thank yous because of time. But before we get there, let's also just remind ourselves, never let a good crisis go to waste. And I think we tried to do that in the 5 breakaway sessions. What did come through, and I think something we need to maybe plan further, and I don't know when and how as a team and with new people, and invite new players and new institutes and representatives, academia, activists, etc., to be engaged. There was a shortage around discussion around the informal settlements and how we can engage better around rural planning. Those are some of the gaps I picked up. But I want to thank everybody for joining us today. We started off with 556 participants. I think we were just over 200, maybe close to 300 people. I want to thank all the partners that came in today, and especially to eThekwini for opening up yourself as a learning case again, and for ISOCAP for graciously agreeing to get more partners involved. But to the partners, thank you. Thank you greatly to SALGA, SACN, SEPI, MILE, and then ISOCAP and eThekwini. We're looking forward to a lot more of these kind of engagements, but not because we just have webinars and we can deal with it, but really as a platform for people to engage and ask hard questions. And we don't always have to agree with each other. So it's not like I don't agree with that group, so I'm not gonna, participate. We want as varied voices as we can possibly get, as provocative voices, and let's have those honest conversations, because this is the way we can actually build theory, planning practice, and respond to the realities. So I think on that note, I'd like to say thank you to everyone. Thanks to an amazing team that pulled the technical side together. Thanks to the SACN on the facilitation, but thanks to everybody that made this possible. The rapporteurs, the thought leaders, the presenters, facilitators, and for those that showed up that had faith and gave us 2 hours of your day. I think there's a lot that happens, even though we in South Africa in lockdown, but thanks for your time. Thanks again.
And Soups, finally, thanks to you for allowing so many people to come together and raise important issues, and trust that we will meet again. And as we leave, let's leave the session with a final conscious breath, and just the reminder, Fahima, if we can pull up that opening session image around just the reminder about, as you said, Soups, inherent in every challenge is possibility. Colleagues, go well, go safely, and trust you will be at the forefront of changing planning practice. Bye.
Yes, thank you so much for being present at the webinar. And I hope we can continue this beautiful collaboration with all the partners. And again, as Rihanna said, thank you for your time, and see you very soon again with some interesting topics on planning disrupted. Thank you so much.